West with the Night by Beryl Markham. Chapter 1. Message from Nungwe. How is it possible to bring order out of memory? I should like to begin at the beginning, patiently, like a weaver at his loom. I should like to say, this is the place to start, there can be no other. But there are 100 places to start, for there are 100 names: Mwanza, Serengeti, Nungwe, Molo, Nakuru. There are easily 100 names, and I can begin best by choosing one of them, not because it is first, nor of any importance in a wildly adventurous sense, but because here it happens to be, turned uppermost in my logbook. After all, I am no weaver. Weavers create. This is remembrance, revisitation, and names are keys that open corridors no longer fresh in the mind, but none the less familiar in the heart. So the name shall be Nungwe, as good as any other, entered like this in the log, lending reality, if not order, to memory. Date 16/6/35. Type aircraft, Avro Avian. Markings, VP KAN. Journey, Nairobi to Nungwe. Time, 3 hours 40 minutes. After that comes pilot, self, and remarks, of which there were none. But there might have been. I had been working out of Nairobi as a freelance pilot with the Muthaiga Country Club as my headquarters. Even in 1935, it wasn't easy to get a plane in East Africa, and it was almost impossible to get very far across country without one. There were roads, of course, leading in a dozen directions out of Nairobi. They started out boldly enough, but grew narrow and rough after a few miles, and dwindled into the rock-studded hills, or lost themselves in a morass of red muram mud, or black cotton soil, in the flat country in the valleys. On a map they looked sturdy and incapable of deceit, but to have ventured from Nairobi south toward Machakos or Magadi in anything less formidable than a moderately powered John Deere tractor was optimistic to the point of sheer whimsy, and the road to the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, north and west through Naivasha, called practicable in the dry season, had, when I last used it after a mild rain, an adhesive quality equal to that of the most prized black treacle. This was, of course, an exception. The more travelled roads were good and often paved for a short distance, but once the pavement ended, an aeroplane, if one were at hand, could save hours of weary toil behind the wheel of a lurching car, provided the driver was skillful enough to keep it lurching at all. My plane, though only a two-seater, was busy most of the time in spite of competition from the then barely budding East African, not to say the full-blown Wilson Airways. Nairobi itself was busy and growing, gateway to a still new country, a big country, an almost unknown country. In less than 30 years the town had sprung from a collection of corrugated iron shacks serving the spindly Uganda Railway to a sprawling welter of British, Boers, Indians, Somalis, Abyssinians, natives from all over Africa and a dozen other places. Today its Indian bazaar alone covers several acres. Its hotels, its government offices, its racecourse, and its churches are imposing evidence that modern times and methods have at last caught up with East Africa. But the core of it is still raw and hardly softened at all by the weighty hand of British officialdom. Business goes on, banks flourish, automobiles purr importantly up and down Government Road, and shop girls and clerks think, act, and live about as they do in any modern settlement of 30-odd thousand in any country anywhere. The town lies snugly against the Ati Plains at the foot of the rolling Kikuyu Hills, looking north to Mount Kenya and south to Kilimanjaro in Tanganyika. It is a counting house in the wilderness, a place of shillings and pounds and land sales and trade, extraordinary successes and extraordinary failures. Its shops sell whatever you need to buy. Farms and coffee plantations surround it for more than 100 miles, and goods trains and lorries supply its markets with produce daily. But what is 100 miles in a country so big? Beyond are villages still sleeping in the forests, on the great reservations, villages peopled with human beings only vaguely aware that the even course of their racial life may somehow be endangered by the persistent and irresistible pressure of the white man. But white men's wars are fought on the edges of Africa. You can carry a machine gun 300 miles inland from the sea, and you are still on the edge of it. Since Carthage and before, men have hacked and scrabbled for permanent footholds along the coasts and in the deserts and on the mountains, and where these footholds have been secured, the right to hold them has been the cause of endless dispute and bloodshed. Competitors in conquest have overlooked the vital soul of Africa herself, from which emanates the true resistance to conquest. The soul is not dead but silent, the wisdom not lacking, but of such simplicity as to be counted non-existent in the tinker's mind of modern civilization. Africa is of an ancient age, and the blood of many of her peoples is as venerable and as chaste as truth. What upstart race, sprung from some recent callow century to arm itself with steel and boastfulness, can match in purity the blood of a single Masai Morani, whose heritage may have stemmed not far from Eden? It is not the weed that is corrupt. Roots of the weed sucked first life from the genesis of earth, and hold the essence of it still. Always the weed returns, the cultured plant retreats before it. Racial purity, true aristocracy, devolved not from edict, nor from rote, but from the preservation of kinship with the elemental forces and purposes of life, whose understanding is not farther beyond the mind of a native shepherd than beyond the cultured fumblings of a mortar-board intelligence. Whatever happens, armies will continue to rumble, colonies may change masters, and in the face of it all, Africa lies and will lie like a great, wisely somnolent giant, unmolested by the noisy drum-rolling of bickering empires. It is not only a land. It is an entity born of one man's hope and another man's fancy. Africa is mystic. It is wild. It is a sweltering inferno. It is a photographer's paradise, a hunter's Valhalla, an escapist's utopia. It is what you will, and it withstands all interpretations. It is the last vestige of a dead world, or the cradle of a shiny new one. To a lot of people, as to myself, it is just home. It is all these things, but one thing. It is never dull. From the time I arrived in British East Africa at the indifferent age of 4, and went through the barefoot stage of early youth hunting wild pig with the Nandi, later training racehorses for a living, and still later scouting Tanganyika in the waterless bush country between the Tana and Ati rivers by aeroplane for elephant, I remained so happily provincial I was unable to discuss the boredom of being alive with any intelligence until I had gone to London and lived there a year. Boredom, like hookworm, is endemic. I have lifted my plane from the Nairobi airport for perhaps 1,000 flights, and I have never felt her wheels glide from the earth into the air without knowing the uncertainty and the exhilaration of firstborn adventure. The call that took me to Nungwe came about 1 o'clock in the morning, relayed from the Muthaiga Country Club to my small cottage in the eucalyptus grove nearby. It was a brief message asking that a cylinder of oxygen be flown to the settlement at once for the treatment of a gold miner near death with a lung disease. The appeal was signed with a name I had never heard, and I remember thinking that there was a kind of pathetic optimism about its having been sent at all, because the only way it could have reached me was through the telegraph station at Mwanza, itself 100 miles by native runner from Nungwe. During the 2 or 3 days the message had been on its way, a man in need of oxygen must either have died or shown a superhuman determination to live. So far as I know, I was the only professional woman pilot in Africa at that time. I had no freelance competition in Kenya, man or woman, and such messages, or at least others not always so urgent or melancholy, were frequent enough to keep me occupied most days and far too many nights. Night flying over charted country by the aid of instruments and radio guidance can still be a lonely business. But to fly in unbroken darkness without even the cold companionship of a pair of earphones, or the knowledge that somewhere ahead are lights and life and a well-marked airport, is something more than just lonely. It is at times unreal, to the point where the existence of other people seems not even a reasonable probability. The hills, the forests, the rocks, and the plains are one with the darkness, and the darkness is infinite. The earth is no more your planet than is a distant star, if a star is shining. The plain is your planet, and you are its sole inhabitant. Before such a flight, it was this anticipation of aloneness, more than any thought of physical danger, that used to haunt me a little, and make me wonder sometimes if mine was the most wonderful job in the world after all. I always concluded that, lonely or not, it was still free from the curse of boredom. 350 miles can be no distance in a plane, or it can be from where you are to the end of the earth. It depends on so many things. If it is night, it depends on the depth of the darkness and the height of the clouds, the speed of the wind, the stars, the fullness of the moon. It depends on you, if you fly alone, not only on your ability to steer your course or to keep your altitude, but upon the things that live in your mind while you swing suspended between the earth and the silent sky. Some of those things take root and are with you long after the flight itself is a memory. But if your course was over any part of Africa, even the memory of it will remain strong. When much later than Nungwe or Tripoli or Zanzibar, or any of the remote and sometimes outlandish places I have flown to, I crossed the North Atlantic, east to west, there were headlines, fanfare, and for me, many sleepless nights. A generous American press found that flight spectacular, and what is spectacular is news. But to leave Nairobi and arrive at Nungwe is not spectacular. It is not news. It is only a little hop from here to there. And to one who does not know the plains of Africa, its swamps, its night sounds and its night silences, such a flight is not only unspectacular, but perhaps tedious as well. Only not to me. For Africa was the breath and life of my childhood. It is still the host of all my darkest fears. A cradle of mysteries always intriguing but never wholly solved. It is the remembrance of sunlight and green hills, cool water, and the yellow warmth of bright mornings. It is as ruthless as any sea, more uncompromising than its own deserts. It is without temperance in its harshness or in its favors. It yields nothing, offering much to men of all races. But the soul of Africa, its integrity, the slow, inexorable pulse of its life, is its own, and of such singular rhythm that no outsider, unless steeped from childhood in its endless even beat, can ever hope to experience it, except only as a bystander might experience a Maasai war dance, knowing nothing of its music, nor the meaning of its steps. So I am off to Nungwe. A silly word, a silly place. A place of small hopes and small successes, buried like the inconsequential treasure of an imaginative miser, out of bounds and out of most men's wanting, below the Mau escarpment, below the Speke Gulf, below the unsurveyed stretches of the western province. Oxygen to a sick miner, but this flight is not heroic. It is not even romantic. It is a job of work, a job to be done at an uncomfortable hour with sleep in my eyes and half a grumble on my lips. Ruta calls contact and swings the propeller. Ruta is a Nandi, anthropologically a member of a Nilotic tribe, humanly a member of a smaller tribe, a more elect tribe, the tribe composed of those too few, precisely sensitive but altogether indomitable individuals, contributed sparingly by each race, exclusively by none. He is of the tribe that observes with equal respect the soft voice and the hardened hand, the fullness of a flower, the quick finality of death. His is the laughter of a free man, happy at his work, a strong man with lust for living. He is not black. His skin holds the sheen and warmth of used copper. His eyes are dark and wide-spaced, his nose full-boned and capable of arrogance. He is arrogant now, swinging the propeller. laying his lean hands on the curved wood, feeling an exultant kinship in the coiled resistance to his thrust. He swings hard, a splutter, strangled cough from the engine like the premature stirring of a sleep-slugged labourer. In the cockpit I push gently on the throttle, easing it forward, rousing the motor, feeding it, soothing it. Arap Ruta moves the wooden chocks from the wheels and steps backward away from the wing. Fitful splashes of crimson light from crude oil torches set round the field stain the dark cloth of the African night and play upon his alert, high-boned face. He raises his hand, and I nod as the propeller, whirring itself into invisibility, pulls the plane forward past him. Ahead of me lies a land that is unknown to the rest of the world, and only vaguely known to the African. A strange mixture of grassland, scrub, desert sand like long waves of the southern ocean, forest, still water, and age-old mountains, stark and grim like mountains of the moon, salt lakes and rivers that have no water, swamps, badlands, land without life, land teeming with life, all of the dusty past, all of the future. The air takes me into its realm. Night envelops me entirely, leaving me out of touch with the earth, leaving me within this small, moving world of my own, living in space with the stars. He was a good lion. When I was a child, I spent all my days with the Nandi Morani, hunting barefooted in the Rongai Valley, or in the cedar forests of the Mau Escarpment. At first I was not permitted to carry a spear, but the Morani depended on nothing else. You cannot hunt an animal with such a weapon unless you know the way of his life. You must know the things he loves, the things he fears, the paths he will follow. You must be sure of the quality of his speed and the measure of his courage. He will know as much about you, and at times make better use of it. But my Morani friends were patient with me. "Amin Yut," one would say, "what but a dik-dik will run like that? Your eyes are filled with clouds today, Lakwait." That day my eyes were filled with clouds, but they were young enough eyes, and they soon cleared. There were other days and other dik-dik. There were so many things. There were dik-dik and leopard, Congoni and warthog, buffalo, lion, and the hare that jumps. There were many thousands of the hare that jumps, and there were wildebeest and antelope. There was the snake that crawls and the snake that climbs. There were birds and young men like whips of leather, like rain shafts in the sun, like spears before a singiri. "Amin Yut," the young men would say, "this is no buffalo spoor, Lakwait. Here, bend down and look. Bend down and look at this mark. See how this leaf is crushed. Feel the wetness of this dung. Bend down and look, so that you may learn." And so in time I learned. But some things I learned alone. There was a place called Elkington's Farm by Kabete Station. It was near Nairobi on the edge of the Kikuyu Reserve, and my father and I used to ride there from town on horses or in a buggy, and along the way my father would tell me things about Africa. One day when we were riding to Elkington's, my father spoke about lions. "Lions are more intelligent than some men," he said, "and more courageous than most. A lion will fight for what he has and for what he needs. He is contemptuous of cowards and wary of his equals. But he is not afraid. You can always trust a lion to be exactly what he is, and never anything else. Except," he added, looking more paternally concerned than usual, "that damned lion of Elkington's." The Elkington lion was famous within a radius of 12 miles in all directions from the farm, because if you happened to be anywhere inside that circle, you could hear him roar when he was hungry, when he was sad, or when he just felt like roaring. If in the night you lay sleepless on your bed and listened to an intermittent sound that began like the bellow of a banshee trapped in the bowels of Kilimanjaro, and ended like the sound of that same banshee, suddenly at large and arrived at the foot of your bed, you knew, because you had been told, that this was the song of Paddy. 2 or 3 of the settlers in East Africa at that time had caught lion cubs and raised them in cages, but Paddy, the Elkington lion, had never seen a cage. He had grown to full size, tawny, black-maned and muscular, without a worry or a care. He lived on fresh meat, not of his own killing. He spent his waking hours, which coincided with everybody else's sleeping hours, wandering through Elkington's fields and pastures like an affable, if apostrophic, emperor, a stroll in the gardens of his court. He thrived in solitude. He had no mate, but pretended indifference and walked alone, not toying too much with imaginings of the unattainable. There were no physical barriers to his freedom, but the lions of the plains do not accept into their respected fraternity an individual bearing in his coat the smell of men. So Paddy ate, slept, and roared, and perhaps he sometimes dreamed, but he never left Elkington's. He was a tame lion, Paddy was. He was deaf to the call of the wild. "I'm always careful of that lion," I told my father, "but he's really harmless. I have seen Mrs. Elkington stroke him." "Which proves nothing," said my father. "A domesticated lion is only an unnatural lion, and whatever is unnatural is untrustworthy." Whenever my father made an observation as deeply philosophical as that one, and as inclusive, I knew there was nothing more to be said. I nudged my horse, and we broke into a canter, covering the remaining distance to Elkington's. It wasn't a big farm, as farms went in Africa before the First World War, but it had a very nice house with a large veranda on which my father, Jim Elkington, and Mrs. Elkington, and one or two other settlers sat and talked, with what to my mind was always unreasonable solemnity. There were drinks, but beyond that there was a tea-table lavishly spread, as only the English can spread them. I have sometimes thought since of the Elkingtons' tea-table, round, capacious and white, standing with sturdy legs against the green vines of the garden, 1,000 miles of Africa receding from its edge. It was a mark of sanity, I suppose, less than of luxury. It was evidence of the double debt England still owes to ancient China for her two gifts that made expansion possible, tea and gunpowder. But cakes and muffins were no fit bribery for me. I had pleasures of my own then, or constant expectations. I made what niggardly salutations I could bring forth from a disinterested memory, and left the house at a gait rather faster than a trot. As I scampered past the square hay-shed 100 yards or so behind the Elkington house, I caught sight of Bishon Singh, whom my father had sent ahead to tend our horses. I think the Sikh must have been less than 40 years old then, but his face was never any indication of his age. On some days he looked 30, and on others he looked 50, depending on the weather, the time of day, his mood, or the tilt of his turban. If he had ever disengaged his beard from his hair and shaved the one and clipped the other, he might have astonished us all by looking like one of Kipling's elephant boys, but he never did either, and so to me at least he remained a man of mystery, without age or youth, but burdened with experience, like the wandering Jew. He raised his arm and greeted me in Swahili as I ran through the Elkington farmyard and out toward the open country. Why I ran at all, or with what purpose in mind, is beyond my answering, but when I had no specific destination, I always ran as fast as I could, in the hope of finding one, and I always found it. I was within 20 yards of the Elkington lion before I saw him. He lay sprawled in the morning sun, huge, black-maned, and gleaming with life. His tail moved slowly, stroking the rough grass like a knotted rope end. His body was sleek and easy, making a mould where he lay, a cool mould that would be there when he had gone. He was not asleep, he was only idle. He was rusty red and soft, like a strokable cat. I stopped, and he lifted his head with magnificent ease and stared at me out of yellow eyes. I stood there staring back, scuffling my bare toes in the dust, pursing my lips to make a noiseless whistle. A very small girl who knew about lions. Paddy raised himself then, emitting a little sigh, and began to contemplate me with a kind of quiet premeditation, like that of a slow-witted man fondling an unaccustomed thought. I cannot say that there was any menace in his eyes, because there wasn't, or that his frightful jowls were drooling, because they were handsome jowls, and very tidy. He did sniff the air, though, with what impressed me as being close to audible satisfaction, and he did not lie down again. I remembered the rules that one remembers. I did not run. I walked very slowly, and I began to sing a defiant song. Kali koma simbasisi, I sang. Asikari yoti niodari. Fierce like the lion are we, Askari all are brave. I went in a straight line past Paddy when I sang it, seeing his eyes shine in the thick grass, watching his tail beat time to the meter of my ditty. 2020, kupigana, piga adui, piga sana. Let us go, to fight, beat down the enemy, beat hard, beat hard. What lion would be unimpressed with the marching song of the King's African Rifles? Singing it still, I took up my trot toward the rim of the low hill, which might, if I were lucky, have Cape gooseberry bushes on its slopes. The country was grey-green and dry, and the sun lay on it closely, making the ground hot under my bare feet. There was no sound and no wind. Even Paddy made no sound, coming swiftly behind me. What I remember most clearly of the moment that followed are three things: a scream that was barely a whisper, a blow that struck me to the ground, and as I buried my face in my arms and felt Paddy's teeth close on the flesh of my leg, a fantastically bobbing turban, that was Bishon Singh's turban, appear over the edge of the hill. I remained conscious, but I closed my eyes and tried not to be. It was not so much the pain as it was the sound. The sound of Paddy's roar in my ears will only be duplicated, I think, when the doors of hell slip their wobbly hinges one day and give voice and authenticity to the whole panorama of Dante's poetic nightmares. It was an immense roar that encompassed the world and dissolved me in it. I shut my eyes very tight and lay still under the weight of Paddy's paws. Bishon Singh said afterward that he did nothing. He said he had remained by the hay-shed for a few minutes after I ran past him, and then, for no explainable reason, had begun to follow me. He admitted, though, that a little while before he had seen Paddy go in the direction I had taken. The Sikh called for help, of course, when he saw the lion meant to attack, and half a dozen of Elkington's syces had come running from the house. Along with them had come Jim Elkington with a rawhide whip. Jim Elkington, even without a rawhide whip, was very impressive. He was one of those enormous men whose girths alone seemed to preclude any possibility of normal movement, much less of speed. But Jim had speed, not to be loosely compared with lightning, but rather like the speed of something spherical and smooth and relatively irresistible, like the cannonballs of the Napoleonic Wars. Jim was, without question, a man of considerable courage, but in the case of my rescue from the lion, it was, I am told, his momentum rather than his bravery for which I must forever be grateful. It happened like this, as Bishon Singh told it. I am resting against the walls of the place where hay is kept, and first the large lion and then you, Beru, pass me going toward the open field, and a thought comes to me that a lion and a young girl are strange company, so I follow. I follow to the place where the hill that goes up becomes the hill that goes down, and where it goes down deepest, I see that you are running without much thought in your head, and the lion is running behind you with many thoughts in his head, and I scream for everybody to come very fast. Everybody comes very fast, but the large lion is faster than anybody, and he jumps on your back, and I see you scream, but I hear no scream. I only hear the lion, and I begin to run with everybody, and this includes Bwana Elkington, who is saying a great many words I do not know, and is carrying a long kiboko, which he holds in his hand and is meant for beating the large lion. Bwana Elkington goes past me the way a man with lighter legs and fewer inches around his stomach must go past me, and he is waving the long kiboko so that it whistles over all our heads like a very sharp wind. But when we get close to the lion, it comes to my mind that that lion is not of the mood to accept a kiboko. He is standing with the front of himself on your back, Beru, and you are bleeding in 3 or 5 places, and he is roaring. I do not believe Bwana Elkington could have thought that that lion at that moment would consent to being beaten, because the lion was not looking the way he had ever looked before, when it was necessary for him to be beaten. He was looking as if he did not wish to be disturbed by a kiboko, or the Bwana, or the syces, or Bishon Singh, and he was saying so in a very large voice. I believe that Bwana Elkington understood this voice when he was still more than several feet from the lion, and I believe that Bwana considered in his mind that it would be the best thing not to beat the lion just then. But the Bwana, when he runs very fast, is like the trunk of a great baobab tree rolling down a slope, and it seems that because of this it was not possible for him to explain the thought of his mind to the soles of his feet in a sufficient quickness of time to prevent him from rushing much closer to the lion than in his heart he wished to be. And it was this circumstance, as I am telling it, said Bishon Singh, which in my considered opinion made it possible for you to be alive, Beru. Bwana Elkington rushed at the lion, then Bishon Singh. The lion, as of the contrary, rushed at Bwana Elkington, said Bishon Singh. The lion deserted you for the Bwana, Beru. The lion was of the opinion that his master was not in any honest way deserving of a portion of what he, the lion, had accomplished in the matter of fresh meat, through no effort by anybody except himself. Bishon Singh offered this extremely reasonable interpretation with impressive gravity, as if he were expounding the case for the lion to a chosen jury of Paddy's peers. Fresh meat, I repeated dreamily, and crossed my fingers. So then what happened? The Sikh lifted his shoulders and then let them drop again. What could happen, Beru? The lion rushed for Bwana Elkington, who in his turn rushed from the lion, and in so rushing did not keep in his hand the long kiboko, but allowed it to fall upon the ground, and in accomplishing this the Bwana was free to ascend a very fortunate tree, which he did. And you picked me up, Bishon Singh. He made a little dip with his massive turban. I was happy with the duty of carrying you back to this very bed, Beru, and of advising your father, who had gone to observe some of Bwana Elkington's horses, that you had been moderately eaten by the large lion. Your father returned very fast, and Bwana Elkington some time later returned very fast. But the large lion has not returned at all. The large lion had not returned at all. That night he killed a horse, and the next night he killed a yearling bullock, and after that a cow fresh for milking. In the end he was caught and finally caged, but brought to no rendezvous with the firing squad at sunrise. He remained for years in his cage, which, had he managed to live in freedom with his inhibitions, he might never have seen at all. It seems characteristic of the mind of man that the repression of what is natural to humans must be abhorred, but that what is natural to an infinitely more natural animal must be confined within the bounds of a reason peculiar only to men, more peculiar sometimes than seems reasonable at all. Paddy lived, people stared at him, and he stared back, and this went on until he was an old, old lion. Jim Elkington died, and Mrs. Elkington, who really loved Paddy, was forced, because of circumstances beyond her control or Paddy's, to have him shot by Boy Long, the manager of Lord Delamere's estates. This choice of executioners was in itself a tribute to Paddy, for no one loved animals more or understood them better, or could shoot more cleanly than Boy Long. But the result was the same to Paddy. He had lived and died in ways not of his choosing. He was a good lion. He had done what he could about being a tame lion. Who thinks it is just to be judged by a single error? I still have the scars of his teeth and claws, but they are very small now and almost forgotten, and I cannot begrudge him his moment. Praise God for the blood of the bull. Arap Maina clasped the gourd of blood and curdled milk in both hands and looked toward the sun. He chanted in a low voice, Praise God for the blood of the bull, which brings strength to our loins, and for the milk of the cow, which gives warmth to the breasts of our lovers. He drank deeply of the gourd then, let his belch roll upward from his belly and resound against the morning silence. It was a silence that we who stood there preserved until Arap Maina had finished, because this was religion. It was the ritual that came before the hunt. It was the Nandi custom. Praise God for the blood of the bull, we said, and stood before the Singiri and waited. Jebta had brought the gourds for Arap Maina, for Arap Koski, and for me, but she looked only at me. The heart of a Morani is like unto stone, she whispered, and his limbs have the speed of an antelope. Where do you find the strength and the daring to hunt with them, my sister? We were as young as each other, Jebta and I, but she was a Nandi, and if the men of the Nandi were like unto stone, their women were like unto leaves of grass. They were shy, and they were feminine, and they did the things that women are meant to do, and they never hunted. I looked down at the ankle-length skins Jebta wore, which rustled like taffeta when she moved, and she looked at my khaki shorts and lanky, naked legs. Your body is like mine, she said. It is the same, and it is no stronger. She turned, avoiding the men with her eyes, because that too was law, and went quickly away, tittering like a small bird. The blood of the bull, said Arap Maina. We are ready. Arap Koski drew his sword from its scabbard and tested its blade. The scabbard was of leather, dyed red, and it hung on a beaded belt that encircled narrow and supple hips. He tested the blade and put it back into the red scabbard. By the sacred womb of my mother, we will kill the wild boar today. He moved forward behind Arap Maina with his broad shield and his straight spear, and I followed Arap Koski with my own spear that was still new and very clean, and lighter than theirs. Behind me came Buller with no spear and no shield, but with the heart of a hunter and jaws that were weapons enough. There were the other dogs, but there was no dog like Buller. We left the Singiri with the first light of the sun warming the roofs of the huts, with cattle, goats, and sheep moving along the trails that led to open pastures, fat cattle, pampered cattle, attended as always by the young, uncircumcised boys. There were cows, steers, and heifers, liquid brown eyes, wet, friendly nostrils, slobbery mouths that covered our legs with sticky fluid as Arap Maina pushed the stupid heads aside with his shield. There were the pungent stench of goat's urine and a hot, comforting odour seeping through the hides of the cattle and light on the long muscles of Arap Maina and Arap Koski. There was the whole of the day ahead, and the world to hunt in. His little ritual forgotten now, Arap Maina was no longer stern. He laughed when Arap Koski or I slipped in the cattle dung that littered our path, and shook his spear at a big black bull, busy tearing up the earth with his hooves. Take care of your people, and dare not insult me with a barren cow this year. But for the most part we ran silently, in single file, skirting the edge of the dense Mau forest, wheeling north to descend into the Rongai Valley, its bottom 1,000 feet below us. 8 weeks had passed since the end of the heavy rains, and the grass in the valley had already reached the height of a man's knee. The ears had begun to ripen in patches. Looking down upon it, the whole was like a broad counterpane dyed in rust and yellow and golden brown. We filed along our path, almost invisible now, through the fresh-smelling Leleshwa bush, avoiding with quick turns and careful leaps the stinging nettle and the shrubs that were armed with thorns. Buller ran at my heels, with the native dogs spread fanwise behind. Halfway down the slope of the valley, a bevy of partridges rose from the grass and wheeled noisily into the sky. Arap Maina lifted his spear almost imperceptibly. Arap Koski's long muscles were suddenly rigid. Watching him, I froze in my tracks and held my breath. It was the natural reaction of all hunters, that moment of listening after any alarm. But there was nothing. The spear of Arap Maina dipped gently. The long muscles of Arap Koski sprang again to life. Buller flicked his stubby tail, and we were off again, one behind another, with the warm sunlight weaving a pattern of our shadows in the thicket. The heat of the valley rose to meet us. Singing cicadas, butterflies like flowers before a wind fluttered against our bodies or hovered over the low bush. Only small things that were safe in the daylight moved. We had run another mile before the cold nose of Buller nudged against my leg, and the dog slipped quickly past me, past the two Morani, to plant himself, alert and motionless, in the centre of our path. "Stop!" I whispered the word, putting my hand on Arap Koski's shoulder. "Buller has scented something." "I believe you are right, Lakwit." With a wave of his hand, Arap Koski ordered the pack of native dogs to crouch. In that they were well trained. They pressed their lean bellies on the ground, cocked their ears, but scarcely seemed to breathe. Arap Maina, sensing the need for free action, began laying down his shield. The fingers of his left hand still touched the worn leather of its handle. His legs were still bent at the knee, when a male reedbuck bounded high into the air more than 50 yards away. I saw Arap Koski's body bend like a bow and watched his spear fly to his shoulder, but he was too late. The spear of Arap Maina flashed in a quick arc of silver light, and the reedbuck fell with the hard point sunk deep under his heart. Not even his first frantic bound had been completed before Arap Maina's arm had brought him down. "Kararani! The hand of our leader is swifter than the flight of an arrow and stronger than the stroke of a leopard." Heaping praise on Arap Maina, Arap Koski ran toward the fallen reedbuck, the sword from his red leather sheath drawn for the kill. I looked at Arap Maina's slender arms with their even, flat muscles and saw no visible sign of such immense strength. Arap Maina, like Arap Koski, was tall and lithe as a young bamboo, and his skin glowed like an ember under a whisper of wind. His face was young and hard, but there was soft humor in it. There was love of life in it, love for the hunt, love for the sureness of his strength, love for the beauty and usefulness of his spear. The spear was made of pliant steel, tempered and forged by the metallist of his own tribe. But it was also more than that. To each Morani, his spear is a symbol of his manhood, and as much a part of himself as the sinews of his body. His spear is a manifestation of his faith. Without it he can achieve nothing, no land, no cattle, no wives. Not even honor can be his until that day comes after his circumcision, when he stands before the gathered members of his tribe, men and women of all ages, from manyatas as scattered as the seeds of wild grass, and swears allegiance to them and to their common heritage. He takes the spear from the hands of the Ol Oiboini and holds it, as he will always hold it while there is strength in his arms and no cloud of age before his eyes. It is the emblem of his blood and his breeding, and possessing it, he is suddenly a man. Possessing it, it is never afterward beyond his reach. Arap Maina placed his left foot on the reedbuck and carefully drew out his spear. "I do not know. It may have struck a bone," he said. He ran bloody fingers along the sharp edges of the weapon and let a little smile twist his lips. "By the will of God, the metal is not chipped. My spear is unhurt." He stooped to pluck a handful of grass and wipe the blood from the bright warm steel. Arap Koski and I had already begun to skin the animal, using our bushman's friends. There was not much time to waste because our real hunt for the wild boar had not yet begun, but still the meat of the reedbuck would provide food for the dogs. "The sun has hit the valley," said Arap Maina. "If we do not hurry, the pigs will have gone in all directions like rolling weeds in a wind." Arap Koski buried his fingers along the walls of the reedbuck's stomach, tearing it from the animal's frame. "Hold this, Lakwani," he said, "and help me separate the intestines for the dogs." I took the slippery, jelly-like stomach in my hands and held it while I kneeled over the reedbuck. "Maina, I still don't know how you managed to throw in time from the position you were in." Arap Koski smiled. "He is a Morani, Lakwani, and a Morani must always throw in time. Otherwise, someday a dangerous animal might charge swifter than the spear. Then, instead of mourning his death, our girls would laugh and say he should have stayed at home with the old men." Arap Maina leaned down and cut a chunk of meat from the cleanly skinned buck. He handed it to me for Buller.
The rest he and Arap Koski left to the native mongrels. Buller trotted a short distance away from the kill, dropped his reward in a little pool of shade, and regarded his snarling cousins with exquisite disdain. In the language that he spoke and only I understood, he said quite clearly, with just a tinge of Swahili accent, "By the noble ancestry of my bull-terrier father, those animals behave like the wild dog." "And now," said Arap Maina, moving away from the carnage, "we must make ready for the hunt." The two Morani wore ochre-coloured shukas, each falling loosely from a single knot on the left shoulder, and each looking somewhat like a scanty Roman toga. They untied the knots now, wrapped the shukas prudently around their waists, and stood in the sun, the muscles in their backs rippling under their oiled skins like fretted water over a stony bed. "Who can move freely with clothes on his body?" Arap Koski said as he helped Arap Maina with the leather thong that bound his braided headdress in place. "Who has seen the antelope run with rags upon his back to hinder his speed?" "Who indeed?" said Arap Maina, smiling. "I think sometimes you babble like a demented goat, Koski. The sun is high and the valley still lies below us, and you speak to Lakwani of antelope wearing shukas? Take up your spears, my friends, and let us go." Single file again, with Arap Maina in the lead, then Arap Koski, then myself, and Buller just behind, we ran on down into the valley. There were no clouds, and the sun stared down on the plain, making heat waves rise from it like flames without colour. The equator runs close to the Rongai Valley, and even at so high an altitude as this we hunted in, the belly of the earth was hot as live ash under our feet, except for an occasional gust of fretful wind that flattened the high corn-like grass. Nothing uttered. Nothing in the valley stirred. The chirp-like drone of grasshoppers was dead. Birds left the sky unmarked. The sun reigned, and there were no aspirants to his place. We stopped by the red salt lick that cropped out of the ground in the path of our trail. I did not remember a time when the salt lick was as deserted as this. Always before it had been crowded with granti, impala, kongoni, eland, waterbuck, and a dozen kinds of smaller animals. But it was empty today. It was like a marketplace whose flow and bustle of life you had witnessed 99 times, but on your 100th visit was vacant and still, without even an urchin to tell you why. I put my hand on Arap Maina's arm. "What are you thinking, Maina? Why is there no game today? Be quiet, Lakwit, and do not move." I dropped the butt of my spear on the earth and watched the two Morani stand still as trees, their nostrils distended, their ears alert to all things. Arap Koski's hand was tight on his spear, like the claw of an eagle clasping a branch. "It is an odd sign," murmured Arap Maina, "when the salt lick is without company." I had forgotten Buller, but the dog had not forgotten us. He had not forgotten that with all the knowledge of the two Morani, he still knew better about such things. He thrust his body roughly between Arap Maina and myself, holding his black wet nose close to the ground, and the hairs along his spine stiffened, his hackles rose, and he trembled. We might have spoken, but we didn't. In his way, Buller was more eloquent. Without a sound, he said as clearly as it could be said, "Lion." "Do not move, Lakwit." Arap Koski stepped closer to me. "Steady, Buller," I whispered to the dog, trying to soothe his rising belligerence. Our eyes followed the direction of Arap Maina's eyes. He was staring into a small, grass-curtained donga a few yards from the edge of the salt lick. The lion that stood in the donga was not intimidated by Arap Maina's stare. He was not concerned with our number. He swung his tail in easy arcs, stared back through the wispy grass, and his manner said, "I am within my rights. If you seek a battle, what are we waiting for?" He moved slowly forward, increasing the momentum of his tail, flaunting his thick black mane. "Ah, this is bad," "He is angry. He wants to attack." Arap Maina spoke in an undertone. "No animal, however fast, has greater speed than a charging lion over a distance of a few yards. It is a speed faster than thought, faster always than escape." Under my restraining hand I felt the muscles of Buller knot and relax in a surging flow of mounting fury. Buller's mind had reached its blind spot. Uncontrolled, he would throw himself in gallant suicide straight at the lion. I dug my fingers into the dog's coat and held tight. Arap Maina's appearance was transformed. His face had taken on a sullen, arrogant expression. His square, bold jaw jutted forward, his eyes dimmed almost dreamily and sank behind high, shiny cheekbones. I watched the muscles on his neck swell like those on the neck of an angry snake, and saw flecks of white froth appear in the corners of his mouth. Passive and rigid, he stared back at the lion. He raised his shield at last, as if to make sure it was still in his hand, and let his spear arm drop to his side to preserve all of its power for whatever might come. He knew that if the lion attacked, his own skill and Arap Koski's would in the end prove sufficient, but not before at least one of us had been killed or badly mauled. Arap Maina was more than a Morani. He was a leader of Morani, and as such he must be able to think as well as to fight. He must be capable of strategy. Watching him still, as he in turn watched the lion, I knew that he had a plan of action. "Observe his eyes," he said. "He thinks very hard of many things. He believes that we also think of those same things. We must show him that we are as fearless as he himself is fearless, but that his desires are not our desires. We must walk straight past him firmly and with courage, and we must shame his anger by laughter and loud talk." Arap Koski's brow was dotted with small bubbles of sweat. A slight flicker of a smile crept over his face. "Yes, true enough. The lion thinks of many things. I too think of many things, and so does Lakwit. But your plan is a good one. We will try it." Arap Maina lifted his head a little higher, turning it only enough to keep the lion within the scope of his vision. He placed one sinewy leg in front of the other, and stiffly, like a man walking the trunk of a tree that bridges a chasm, he began to move. One after another we followed. My hand still lay upon Buller's neck, but Arap Koski let the dog and me slip past him to walk between the two Morani. "Stay close to me, Lakwit." Arap Maina's voice was anxious. "I fear for you when it is not possible to see you." Arap Koski burst suddenly into forced laughter. "Ha, ha, ha! There is a tale about a rhino who needed a needle to do her husband's sewing," he began. "So she borrowed one from the porcupine," said Arap Koski. "And swallowed it," I contributed. "I have heard that tale before, Koski." The Morani laughed louder. "Ha, ha, ha, ha! But perhaps our friend the lion has not. Look at him. He is listening." "But not laughing," said Arap Maina. "He moves as we move. He comes closer. Ha, 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 ha!" The lion had stalked out of the donga. Now, as we walked, we could see that he guarded the slain body of a large Kongoni. Smears of blood were fresh on his forelegs, his jowls, and his chest. He was a lone hunter, an individualist, a solitary marauder. His tail had stopped swinging, his great head turned exactly in ratio to the speed of our stride. The full force of the lion's smell, meaty, pungent, almost indescribable, struck against our nostrils. "Having swallowed the needle," said Arap Koski, "silence! He attacks!" I do not know who moved with greater speed, Arap Maina or the lion. I believe it must have been Arap Maina. I think the Morani anticipated the charge even before the lion moved, and because of that it was a battle of wills instead of weapons. The lion rushed from the fringe of the donga like a rock from a catapult. He stopped like the same rock, striking the walls of a battlement. Arap Maina was down on his left knee. Beside him was Arap Koski, each man with his shield, his spear, and his body was a fighting machine no longer human, but only motionless and precise and coldly ready. Buller and I crouched behind them, my own spear as ready as I could make it in hands that were less hot from the sun than from excitement and the pounding of my heart. "Steady, Buller! "Do not move, Lakwit." The lion had stopped. He stood a few strides from Arap Maina's buffalo hide shield, stared into Arap Maina's eyes, challenging him over the top of it, and swung his tail like the weight of a clock. At that moment, I think, the ants in the grass paused in their work. And then Arap Maina stood up. I do not know how he knew that that particular instant was the right instant, or how he knew that the lion would accept a truce. It may have been accomplished by the sheer arrogance of Arap Maina's decision to lower his shield, even if slightly, and to rise no longer warlike, and to beckon us on with superb and sudden indifference. But however it was, the lion never moved. We left him, slicing the tall grass with his heavy tail, the blood of the Congoni drying on his coat. He was thinking many things, and I was disappointed. Long after we had continued our trot toward the place where we knew there would be warthog, I thought how wonderful it would have been if the lion had attacked, and I had been able to use my spear on him while he clawed at the shields of the two Morani, and how later they might have said, "If it hadn't been for you, Lakwit." But then I was very young. We ran until we reached the Molo River. Buller and the native dogs had gone into the river and wallowed in the cool black muck along its banks. Buller returned now, sleek with slime, dripping and happy. He waited until he had the two Morani and me easily within range, and then shook himself with a kind of devilish impudence, and stood wagging his stump tail as we wiped water and mud from our faces. "It is his way of making a joke," said Arap Koski, looking at his spattered shuka. "It is also his way of telling us to move," said Arap Maina. "The hunter who lies on his back in the forest has little food and no sport. We have spent much time today at other things, but the warthog still waits. Seek him out, Buller." But the dog needed no urging from me. He knew warthog country when he saw it, and he knew what to do about it. He rushed on ahead, followed by the native mongrels, running in a little storm of their own dust. I know animals more gallant than the African warthog, but none more courageous. He is the peasant of the plains, the drab and dowdy digger in the earth. He is the uncomely but intrepid defender of family, home, and bourgeois convention, and he will fight anything of any size that intrudes upon his smug existence. Even his weapons are plebeian, curved tusks, sharp, deadly, but not beautiful, used inelegantly for rooting as well as for fighting. He stands higher than a domestic pig when he is full grown, and his hide is dust-colored and tough and clothed in bristles. His eyes are small and lightless and capable of but one expression: suspicion. What he does not understand, he suspects, and what he suspects, he fights. He can leap into the air and gut a horse while its rider still ponders a strategy of attack, and his speed in emerging from his hole to demonstrate the advantage of surprise is almost phenomenal. He is not lacking in guile. He enters his snug little den, which is borrowed, not to say commandeered, from its builder, the ant-bear, tail foremost, so that he is never caught off guard. While he lies thus in wait for the curiosity or indiscretion of his enemy to bring him within range, he uses his snout to pile a heap of fine dust inside the hole. The dust serves as a smoke-screen, bursting into a great enshrouding billow the moment the warthog emerges to battle. He understands the tactical retreat, but is incapable of surrender. And if a dog is less than a veteran, or a man no more than an intrepid novice, not the only blood spilled will be the warthog's. These facts were always in my mind when Buller hunted with us, as he always did. But there was never any question of leaving him. It would have been like preventing a born soldier from marching with his regiment, or like denying a champion fighter the right to compete in the ring on the grounds that he might be hurt. So Buller always came, and often I worried. He ran ahead now, flanked by native dogs. The two Morani and I spread out fanwise, running behind. Our first sign of warthog was the squeal of a baby surprised in a patch of grass by one of the mongrels. The squeal was followed by what seemed to be the squeals of all the baby warthogs in Africa, blended, magnified, and ear-splitting. Panic-stricken, the little pigs ran in all directions, like mice in the dream of a tabby cat, their tails held straight and erect, whisked through the grass as if so many bulrushes had come to life to join in a frantic dance, a mad and somewhat gay dance, but hardly as abandoned as it appeared, because the squeals were not without intent or meaning. They were meant for the small, alert ears of their father, who, when he came, would come with murder aforethought, and come he did. None of us quite knew from where, but in the midst of the bedlam the grass in front of Arap parted as if cleaved by a scythe, and a large boar, blind with rage, plunged from it straight at the Morani. If Buller had not run ahead after his own quarry, things might have happened differently. As it was, there was more amusement than tragedy in what did happen. The boar was larger than average, and the bigger they are, the tougher they are. Their hides are tough as boot leather, and nothing less than a spear thrust in a vital part will stop them. Arap was ready and waiting. The boar lunged, the Morani sidestepped, the spear flashed, and the boar was gone. But not alone. Behind him, spitting the flying dust, swearing in Nandi and in Swahili, ran Arap assisted by 2 of his mongrels, all of them following with their eyes and their legs the drunkenly swaying shaft of Arap spear, its point lodged fast and solid between the shoulders of the boar. Arap and I began to follow, but we couldn't laugh and run at the same time, so we stopped running and watched. In less than a minute the dogs, the man, and the warthog had found the horizon and disappeared behind it like 4 fabulous characters in search of Aesop. We turned and trotted in the direction Buller had taken, listening to his deep, excited barks, which came at regular intervals. After covering about 3 miles, we found him at the side of a large hole, where he had run his warthog to ground. Buller stood gazing at the dusty opening in silence, as if hoping the warthog would be such a fool as to think that since there were no more barks, there was no more dog. But the warthog was not taken in. He would emerge in his own good time, and he knew as well as Buller did that no dog would enter an occupied pig-hole and expect to come out alive. "That's a good boy, Buller." As usual, I was relieved to find him still unhurt, but the moment I spoke, he broke his strategic silence and demanded with much tail-wagging and a series of whining barks that the warthog be roused from his den and be brought to battle. More than once every inch of Buller's body had been ripped open in deep, ugly gashes on such pig hunts, but at least he had lately learned not to go for the boar's head, which in the end is fatal for any dog. Until now I had always managed to reach the scene of conflict in time to spear the warthog, but I might not always be so lucky. I moved carefully to the back of the opening, while Arap stood far to one side. "If only we had some paper to rustle down the hole, Koski." The Morani shrugged. "We will have to try other tricks, Lakwit." It seems silly, and perhaps it is, but very often, after every other method had failed, we had enticed the warthogs into the open long before they were quite ready to attack, simply by rustling a scrap of paper over the entrance of their holes. It was not always easy to get so limited an article as paper in East Africa at that time, but when we had it, it always worked. I haven't any idea of why it worked. Poking a stick through the hole never did, nor shouting into it, nor even using smoke. To the warthog, I think the paper made a sound that was clearly insulting, comparable perhaps to what is known here and there nowadays as a Bronx cheer. But we had no paper. We tried everything else without the least success, and decided finally, in the face of Buller's contempt, to give it up and find out what had happened to Arap on his quest for the vanished spear. We were leaving the scene of our mutual discouragement when Arap curiosity overcame his natural caution. He bent down in front of the dark hole, and the warthog came out. It was more like an explosion than an attack by a wild pig. I could see nothing through the thick burst of dust except extremities, the tail of the boar, the feet of Arap the ears of Buller, and the end of a spear. My own spear was useless in my hands. I might thrust at the warthog only to strike the dog, or the morani. It was an unholy tangle with no end, no beginning, and no opening. It lasted 5 seconds. Then the warthog shot from the tumbling mass like a clod from a whirlwind and disappeared through a corridor of anthills, with Buller just behind, slashing at the fleeing grey rump. I turned to Arap. He sat on the ground in a puddle of his own blood, his right thigh cut through as if it had been hacked with a sword. He pressed a fold of his shukka against the wound and stood up. Buller's bark grew fainter, echoing through the forest of anthills. The boar had won the first battle, and might win the second unless I hurried. "Can you walk, Koski? I must follow Buller. He may get killed." The Morani smiled without mirth. "Of course, Lakvit, this is nothing, except reward for my foolishness. I will go back to the Singiri slowly and have it attended to. It is best that you lose no time and follow Buller. Already the sun is sinking. Go now and run quickly." I clasped the round shaft of the spear tight in my hand and ran with all my strength. For me, because I was still a child, this was a heart-sinking experience. So many thoughts flashed through my mind. Would my strength hold out long enough to save Buller from the tusks of the boar? What had become of Arap Meine? And why had I ever left him? How would poor Koski get home? Would he bleed too badly on the way? I ran on and on, following the barely audible bark of Buller, and the few drops of blood clinging at intervals to the stalks of grass, or soaking into the absorbent earth. It was either Buller's blood or the warthog's. Most likely it was both. Aye, if I could only run a little faster! I must not stop for a minute. My muscles begin to ache, my legs bleed from the wait-a-bit thorns and the blades of elephant grass. My hand, wet with perspiration, slips on the handle of my spear. I stumble, recover, and run on as the sound of Buller's bark grows louder, closer, then fades again. The sun is going, and shadows lay like broad hurdles across my path. Nothing is of any importance to me except my dog. The boar is not retreating. He's leading Buller away from me, away from my help. The blood spoor grows thicker, and there is more of it. Buller's bark is weak and irregular, but a little nearer. There are trees now jutting from the plain, large, solitary, and silent. The barking stops, and there is nothing but the blood to follow. How can there be so much blood? Breathless and running still, I peer ahead into the changing light and see something move in a patch of turf under a flat-topped thorn tree. I stop and wait. It moves again and takes colour, black and white, and splattered with red. It is silent, but it moves. It is Buller. I need neither breath nor muscles to cover the few hundred yards to the thorn tree. I am suddenly there, under its branches, standing in a welter of blood. The warthog, as large as any I have ever seen, 6 times as large as Buller, sits exhausted on his haunches, while the dog rips at its belly. The old boar sees me, another enemy, and charges once more with magnificent courage, and I sidestep and plunge my spear to his heart. He falls forward, scraping the earth with his great tusks, and lies still. I leave the spear in his body, turn to Buller, and feel tears starting to my eyes. The dog is torn open like a slaughtered sheep. His right side is a valley of exposed flesh, from the root of his tail to his head, and his ribs show almost white, like the fingers of a hand smeared with blood. He looks at the warthog, then at me beside him on my knees, and lets his head fall into my arms. He needs water, but there is no water anywhere. Not within miles. Aye, Buller, my poor foolish Buller. He licks my hand, and I think he knows I can do nothing, but forgives me for it. I cannot leave him because the light is almost gone now, and there are leopards that prowl at night and hyenas that attack only the wounded and helpless. If only he lives through the night. If only he lives through the night. There is a hyena on a near hill who laughs at that, but it is a coward's laugh. I sit with Buller and the dead boar under the thorn tree and watch the dark come closer. The world grows bigger as the light leaves it. There are no boundaries and no landmarks. The trees and the rocks and the anthills begin to disappear, one by one, whisked away under the magical cloak of evening. I stroke the dog's head, try to close my eyes, but of course I cannot. Something moves in the tall grass, making a sound like the swish of a woman's skirt. The dog stirs feebly, and the hyena on the hill laughs again. I let Buller's head rest on the turf, stand up and pull my spear from the body of the boar. Somewhere to the left there is a sound, but I do not recognize it, and I can see only dim shapes that are motionless. I lean for a moment on my spear, peering outward at what is nothing, and then turn toward my thorn tree. "Are you here, Lakwani?" Arap Maina's voice, as cool as water on shaded rocks. "I am here, Maina." He is tall and naked, and very dark beside me, his shukka tied around his left forearm to allow his body freedom to run. "You are alone, and you have suffered, my child." "I'm all right, Maina, but I fear for Buller. I think he may die." Arap Maina kneels on the earth and runs his hands over Buller's body. "He is badly hurt, Lakwani, very badly hurt. But do not grieve too much. I think your spear has saved him from death, and God will reward you for that. When the moon shines at midnight, we will carry him home." "I am so happy that you have come, Maina. How is it Koski dared to leave you alone? He has betrayed the trust I had in him." "Do not be angry with Koski. He is badly hurt. His thigh was ripped by the warthog." "He is no child, Lakwit. He is a Morani, and he should have been more careful knowing I was not there. After I recovered my spear, I turned back to find you. I followed the blood on the grass for miles, and then I followed Buller's barking. If the direction of the wind had been wrong, you would still be alone. Koski has the brains of a one-eyed hare." "Aye, what does it matter now, Maina? You are here, and I am not alone. But I am very cold." "Lakwani, lie down and rest. I will keep watch until it is light enough for us to go. You are very tired. Your face has become thin." He cuts handfuls of grass with his sword and makes a pillow, and I lie down, clasping Buller in my arms. The dog is unconscious now, and bleeding badly. His blood trickles over my khaki shorts and my thighs. The distant roar of a waking lion rolls against the stillness of the night, and we listen. It is the voice of Africa, bringing memories that do not exist in our minds or in our hearts, perhaps not even in our blood. It is out of time, but it is there, and it spans a chasm whose other side we cannot see. A ripple of lightning plays across the horizon. "I think there will be a storm tonight, Maina." Arap Maina reaches out in the darkness and puts his hand on my forehead. "Relax, Lakwani, and I will tell you an amusing fable about the cunning little hare." He begins very slowly and softly. "The hare was a thief. In the night he came to the manyatta. He lied to the cow and told her that her calf would die if she moved. Then he stood up on his hind legs and began sucking the milk from the cow's milk bag. But I am asleep. And we be playmates, thou and I. Buller was brought home by moonlight. For a long time he lay still, seeing nothing but the earthen floor in front of his paws, until at last he could lift his head a little, and then he could walk. One day he sniffed at my spear, dipped in its sheath of black ostrich feathers, and waggled his forever expectant tail. But that was after the world had changed, and there was no more boar hunting. The world had changed without any reason that I could see. My father's face had become more grave than it had ever been before, and the voices of the men he spoke with were somber. There was a lot of head-shaking and talk about gloomy, school-bookish places that had nothing to do with Africa. A man of importance had been shot at a place I could not pronounce in Swahili or in English, and because of this shooting, whole countries were at war. It seemed a laborious method of retribution, but that was the way it was being done. So by 1915, the lights had not only gone out all over Europe, but many of what few windows there were had begun darkening in East Africa. War was different in the hinterland. It was a war of men rather than of weapons. Tanks, planes, gas masks, and guns that threw shells 20 miles remained things of the future, even after they were elsewhere blended with the past. The Protectorate fought a frontier war with frontier weapons. It was still dressed in frontier clothes. I never heard the ruffle of drums in those days, or saw many flags dragging precise platoons behind them. I saw men leave their work at the mills, and there were teams of oxen on the farm without their masters. The farm lived, but its voice was a whisper. It produced, but not with the lusty ease it had before. There was less gusto, but Kibii and I did what children do when there are things abroad too big to understand. We stayed close to each other and played games that made no noise. Kibii was a little Nandi boy, younger than I, but we had many things in common. We gained a bond that was forged in the war, and which we would have done without. But for me, years later, in another hemisphere, it exists yet, as it must for him, still in Africa. A messenger came to the farm with a story to tell. It was not a story that meant much as stories went in those days. It was about how the war progressed in German East Africa, and about a tall young man who was killed in it. I suppose he was no taller than most who were killed there, and no better. It was an ordinary story, but Kibii and I, who knew him well, thought there was no story like it, or one as sad, and we think so now. The young man tied his shuka on his shoulder one day and took his shield and his spear and went to war. He thought war was made of spears and shields and courage, and he brought them all. But they gave him a gun, so he left the spear and the shield behind him and took the courage, and went where they sent him because they said this was his duty. And he believed in duty. He believed in duty and in the kind of justice that he knew, and in all the things that were of the earth, like the voice of the forest, the right of a lion to kill a buck, the right of a buck to eat grass, and the right of a man to fight. He believed in many wives, young as he was, and in the telling of stories by the shade of the Singiri. He took the gun and held it the way they had told him to hold it, and walked where they told him to walk, smiling a little, and looking for another man to fight. He was shot and killed by the other man, who also believed in duty, and he was buried where he fell. It was so simple and so unimportant. But of course it meant something to Kibii and me, because the tall young man was Kibii's father and my most special friend. Arap Maina died on the field of action in the service of the king, but some said it was because he had forsaken his spear. "When I am circumcised and become a Murani," Kibii said, "and drink blood and curdled milk like a man instead of ugali and nettles like a woman, I will find whoever it was that killed my father and put my spear in his heart." "You are very selfish, Kibii," I said. "I can jump as high as you can and play all our games just as well. I can throw a spear almost as far. We will find him together and put both our spears in his heart." The days that marked the war went on like the ticking of a clock that had no face and showed no time. After a while it was difficult to remember what it had been like before, or the remembrance had been brought to mind so often that it was tarnished and dull, like a trinket not worth looking at. Kibi and I began living again from hour to hour. We liked walking in the dark, past the edge of the forest, listening to the shrill cry of the hyrax and the noise of the crickets that sounded like the snipping of a million shears. When the world began, Kibi said, each animal, even the chameleon, had a task to do. I learned it from my father and my grandfather, and all our people know this fact. The world began too long ago, I said, longer than anybody could remember. Who could remember what the chameleon did when the world began? Our people remember, said Kibi, because God told it to our first All Oiboini, and this one told it to the next. Each All Oiboini, before he died, repeated to the new All Oiboini what God had said, and so we know these things. We know that the chameleon is accursed above all other animals, because if it had not been for him, there would be no death. It was like this, said Kibi. When the first man was made, he wandered alone in the great forest and on the plains, and he worried very much, because he could not remember yesterday, and so he could not imagine tomorrow. God saw this, so he sent the chameleon to the first man, who was Anandi, with a message saying that there would never be such a thing as death, and that tomorrow would be like today, and that the days would never stop. Long after the chameleon had started, said Kibi, God sent an egret with a different message, saying that there would be a thing called death, and that sometime tomorrow would not come. Whichever message comes first to the ears of man, God warned, will be the true one. Now the chameleon is a lazy animal. He thinks of nothing but food, and he moves only his tongue to get that. He lagged so much along the way that he arrived at the feet of the first man only a moment before the egret. The chameleon began to talk, but he could not. In the excitement of trying to deliver his tidings of eternal life before the egret could speak, the chameleon could only stutter and change stupidly from one color to another, so the egret, in a calm voice, gave the message of death. Since then, said Kibi, all men have died. Our people know this fact. At that time I was naive enough to ponder the verity of such fables. In the years that have passed, I have read and heard more scholarly expositions upon similar subjects. God has changed from God to an unknown quantity. The chameleon has become X, and the egret Y. Life goes on until death stops it. The questions are the same, but the symbols are different. Still, the chameleon is a gay if sluggish fellow, and the egret is a pretty bird. There are doubtless better answers, but somehow, nowadays, I prefer Kibi's. My trail is north. Somebody with a flair for small cynicism once said, we live and do not learn. But I have learned some things. I have learned that if you must leave a place that you have lived in and loved, and where all your yesterdays are buried deep, leave it any way except a slow way. Leave it the fastest way you can. Never turn back, and never believe that an hour you remember is a better hour because it is dead. Past years seem safe ones, vanquished ones, while the future lives in a cloud, formidable from a distance. The cloud clears as you enter it. I have learned this, but like everyone, I learned it late. I left the farm at Njoro, almost the slowest way, and I never saw it again. I would have turned back. Pegasus, who carried me, would have turned back, because even he had woven 3 years of memory to hold him there. But our world was gone like a scrap in the wind, and there wasn't any turning. It all happened because those amiable gods, who most times walked together, or at least agreed on larger things, fell out and neglected to send any rain. All the seeds died one year at Njoro, and on all the farms around Njoro, on the low fields, on the slopes of the hills, on the square plots carved out of forests, On the great farms and on the farms built with no more than a plough and a hope, the seeds died because they were not nourished. They were starved for rain. The sky was as clear as a window one morning. It was so the next morning, and the next, and on every morning that followed, until it was hard to remember how rain felt, or how a field looked green and moist with life, so that a naked foot sank into it. All the things that grew paused in their growing, leaves curled, and each creature turned his back on the sun. Perhaps somewhere in London, in Bombay, in Boston, a newspaper carried a single line on a lesser page, "Drought threatens British East Africa." Perhaps someone read it and looked upward, hoping his own skies that day were as clear as ours, or considered that drought on the farthest rim of Africa was hardly news. It may not have been. It is hardly news when a man you have never seen and never will loses a year's labour, or 10 years' labour, or even a life's labour in a patch of ground too far away to imagine. But when I left Njoro, it was all too close to be easily forgotten. The rain feeds the seed, and the seed the mill. When the rain stops, the mill wheels stop, or if they continue to turn, they grind despair for the man who owns them. My father owned them. In the time that preceded the drought, he had signed contracts with the government and with individuals, committing himself to the delivery of hundreds of tons of flour and meal, at a fixed price and at a fixed date. If the essence of successful business is not to receive 3 times what you give, then it is at least not to receive less than you give. I learned the tyranny of figures before I knew the value of a pound. I learned why my father sat so long and so late, and so fruitlessly over the scribbled pages, the open inkpot, and the sniggering lamp wicks. You could not buy maize at 20 rupees a bag, grind it to meal, then sell the meal at 10 rupees. Or at least you could if you honoured your own word, but you saw your substance run out of the hoppers with every cupful of the stuff you milled. There were men who thought my father a little mad. Contracts had been evaded before, hadn't they? Wasn't God responsible for drought? Yes, and for a number of other things, my father thought, including lack of drought, but he held that God was reasonably innocent in the matter of a signed contract. One day a string of freight cars left the mill siding behind a triumphant little engine. The last of the flour had been milled. All the contracts had been honoured from the first word to the last solemn scratch of ink. The engine made the farthest turn. It hooted once, cast a smudge on the immaculate horizon, and disappeared. It carried with it most of my youth, my father's title to the farm, the buildings, the stables, and all the horses, except just one, the one with wings. "Now," said my father, "we have to think." And so we thought. We sat for an hour in his little study, and he spoke to me more seriously than he had ever done before. His arm lay across the big black book that was closed now, and he told me many things I had never known, and some that I had known. He was going to Peru, an untrammeled country like this one, yet a country that loved horses and needed men who understood them. He wanted me to come, but the choice was mine. At 17 years and several months, I was not a child. I could think, I could act with reason. Did he consider me expert enough to train thoroughbreds professionally? He did, but there was much to learn. Could I ever hope for a trainer's license under English Jockey Club rules? I could, but nothing succeeded like success. I knew too little of Africa to leave it, and what I knew I loved too much. Peru was a name, a smudge of purple on a schoolbook map. I could put my finger on Peru, but my feet were on the earth of Africa. There were trains in Africa, there were some roads, there were towns like Nairobi. There were schools and bright lights and telegraph. There were men who said they had explored Africa. They had written books about it. But I knew the truth. I knew that for myself the country had not yet been found. It was unknown. It had just barely been dreamed. "Go to Molo," said my father. "There are stables at Molo that you could use. Remember that you are still just a girl, and do not expect too much. There are a few owners here and there who will give you horses to train. After that, work and hope. But never hope more than you work." A Spartan thread held through my father's counsel then as now. Nakupa hati mazuri. "Beryl! I've been looking for you." The lean, easy figure of Eric Gooch looms at my shoulder. There is economy in the straight lines of his face. His eyes are blue and candid and lacking worry. He is a farmer who has farmed for years without crying about it. He likes it. He likes all animals, and especially horses. His filly, Wise Child, is in my stable. Now that I've moved to Nakuru, leaving Molo with its smells of Scotland, its cold nights, and its contours so unorthodox, except to a Calvinistic eye, I am in closer touch with the owners of the horses I train. This is the big race, the important race, the Saint-Léger, and most of my hopes and Eric's hang on the satin-sleek shoulders of Wise Child. Eric finds a chair and somehow crowds it up to my table. We put our heads together and talk of what to us are serious things. We mumble under the raucous chorus of voices that blend somehow and rise to the rafters of Vega Club in a crescendo that lacks only a conductor to time its swell. We can talk elsewhere. Nairobi has outgrown its swamp and tin roof days. There are other places for discussing a horse race, but none more appropriate, none more congenial. Vega Club may nowadays be changed. Nakupa hati mazuri, I bring you good fortune, was in my time engraved in the stone of its great fireplace, its broad lounge, its bar, its dining room, none so elaborately furnished as to make a rough-handed hunter pause at its door, nor yet so dowdy as to make a diamond pendant swing ill at ease, were rooms in which the people who made the Africa I knew danced and talked and laughed, hour after hour. Lion, elephant, buffalo, kudu, some dead a day, some dead for years, were revived again and shot again in copses of Wedgwood saucers, behind hillocks of table linen, or in jungles of swizzle sticks. I stood here, my gun-bearer there, tusks just under 200, black-maned devil, big as they come, my heavy rifle in camp. "Ah," says the red-jawed Russian, "lion, listen, my friend, I have fought Siberian wolves. Let there be music." At race meetings there is more than music. At race meetings there is even more than racing, though the trumpeter who heralds each start seems no mere member of the KAR, but a pied piper toward whose high, repeated notes hurry all the keepers of the land, for if they are not children they must nonetheless respond to an irresistible ditty. Just as Arap Ruta was once Kibiyi, British East Africa is now Kenya. Nairobi has a frontier cut to its clothes and wears a broad-brimmed hat, but it tends an English garden. It nurtures the shoots of custom grafted from the old tree. It dresses for dinner, passes its port wine clockwise, and loves a horse race. "And so," says Eric Gooch, "what are our chances?" I frown and shake my head. Without Rack to run against us, they would be perfect. What a thing to have to say. My own skill and labor have molded every muscle on the hard, dynamic body of the chestnut colt. Rack's prowess is the product of my own hands. He is far and away the favorite for the Léger, but he will run against me. Part of that conversation buzzing around these wide white walls is gossip about Rack, little words of speculation droning like bees in a bottle. Eric and I think back. Just 12 weeks ago, Rack had been taken from my stable at Nakuru by his owner and put into the care of another trainer, a man who knew a good thing when he saw it. In the year Rack had been with me, he had developed from a leggy, headstrong colt into a full-formed racehorse, swift, haughty, and contemptuous of competition. Rack could run and knew it. Nervously, his owner had listened to the argument that a girl of 18 could not be entrusted with those precise, finishing touches, that careful shading of muscle against bone, that almost sophistical task of persuading a horse that nothing in his own world of probabilities was so improbable as another horse's ability to beat him past the post. Rack had been taken from me on the strength of the doubt, and my reputation as a trainer, which had only begun to take firm root, was hardly encouraged by the act. But gossip has its better points. Whispers are not restricted to the bearing of bad news, and there are men who smell injustice, however softly it walks.
Eric Gooch had known that I would bring about 15 horses to Nairobi for the big race meeting, and that some of these would win the lesser races. He had also known that without Rack, I had nothing to enter as a serious contender for the classic, the single race that really mattered. Eric had thought hard, and then he had come to my stable from his farm at Nyeri. "I've worried about this thing," he had said, "but I don't know any way out. Rack is already being backed to win, and so far as I can see, there's nothing to stop him. Of course, there's Wise Child, but hell, you know about Wise Child." Know about her. Like Pegasus, she had been born into my hands. Her thoroughbred blood had filtered through 20 generations of winners. Hers was the mettle to match the mettle of Rack. Only there was the question of legs. Wise Child, as a 2-year-old, had been mishandled by her first trainer. Her tendons had been concussed, jarred too early against too hard a track. With all that fire in her heart, all that energy in her tidy bay body, she could barely carry a man on her back. Would it be possible in 12 weeks' time to strengthen those willing but ailing legs, to build them up so that she could drive them 1 3/4 miles and win? Eric had thought not, but she was mine if I would have her. Well, I would have her. It cost only work to try, but to watch Rack, my own Rack, sweep the field bearing alien colours would cost much more. And so it had been settled. Wise Child, of the gentle manner, the soft, kind eyes, and the will to win, if only those legs could be strengthened again, had come into my care at Nakuru. Together we had worked and worried, Arap Ruta, myself, and the little bay filly. But at least we had been blessed with a world of our own to work in. It was a world of absolutes. It held no intermediate shades, neither of sound nor of colour. There were no subtle strokes in the creation of Nakuru. The shores of its lake are rich in silence, lonely with it, but the monotonous flats of sand and mud that circle the shallow water are relieved of dullness, not only by an occasional bird or a flock of birds, or by 100 birds. As long as the day lasts, Nakuru is no lake at all, but a crucible of pink and crimson fire. Each of its flames, its million flames, struck from the wings of a flamingo. 10,000 birds of such exorbitant hue, caught in the scope of an eye, is a sight that loses credence in one's own mind years afterward. But 10,000 flamingos on Lake Nakuru would be a number startling in its insignificance, and 100,000 would barely begin the count. Menengai Crater overlooks the township and the lake. In the time of man it has breathed no brimstone and barely a wisp of smoke, but in the annals of the Rift Valley, which contains all this as a sea contains a coral atoll or a desert a dune, the time of man is too brief a period to deserve more than incidental recording. Tomorrow, next day, or next year, Menengai may become again the brazier over which some passing deity will, for a casual aeon or so, warm his omnipotent hands. But until then, one can stand safely on its edge, watching the lake of pink and scarlet wings so far below, the lake that seems to have stolen, for the moment at least, all the mountain's fire. This was the lavish background against which I worked my horses at Nakuru. My entrance with Arap Ruta and Wise Child on the flat shore each morning just after daylight must have been as anticlimactic as the spectacle of 3 mice crossing a stage gigantically set for the performance of a major Wagnerian opera. I used the shore because it was the only place soft and yielding enough for Wise Child's sensitive legs. My quarters were hardly so elaborate as the hut at Molo had been. By day I lived in a stable I had renovated for my own use, and by night I slept at the very top of the modest little grandstand, built, as was the racecourse, by stolidly British members of the district, who, like all the others of our immutable clan, were allergic to the absence of horses. And each time I had watched Wise Child test her tendons on the moist ground while flamingos rose and settled on the surface of the lake, or sluggard hippopotami waddled into it, I had thought of Rack, disdainful Rack,
How well I knew him! But the 12 weeks had hurried on. The work had been done as skillfully as I could do it. And now, at last, we are here. Now Eric fingers his glass and questions me hopefully, while the music of Muthaiga marches through our talk, and festive people clasp hands, revive old toasts, and make bets on tomorrow's léger. £100. £200. Has the filly a chance? Against Rack? Of course not. Oh, don't be too sure. Don't be too sure. Why, I remember. Well, that's what makes a horse race. Jockey. Sonny Bumpus. What's in a name? At least there's no weight in this one. There's an airy insolence in it. Who would be so heedless as to run a horse against such a happily cocksure combination as Sonny Bumpus on Wise Child? And if this were not enough to ponder, what about Arap Ruta? Arap Ruta, the mystic, the conjurer, the wizard of Njoro. "Aye," he says, as he grooms the filly with inspired hands, "I will make these muscles like the muscles of a Morani ready for battle. I will make them tough as the bow of a Wandorobo. I will put my own strength into them." He spits contempt. "Rack, I warn you. You are a colt, but God has given our filly the blade of a Nandi spear for a heart, and put the will of the wind in her lungs. You cannot win, Rack. I, Arap Ruta, say so." He turns to me. He is solemn. "It is settled, Mem Sahib. Rack will lose." I look up from the plaiting of Wise Child's mane and smile. "There are times, Ruta, when you sound like Kibi." With hesitance my smile is returned. Ruta is thoughtful, but unchastened. "No, Mem Sahib. It is only that I have the power to make truths of my beliefs. It is a thing only a Morani can do." We are in our stable at the racetrack. Within 2 hours the léger will be run. While Ruta grooms, I plait the silky mane, and the blacksmith spreads out his tools to put on Wise Child's aluminum racing plates. The filly stands quiet as a nodding kitten, but she is not asleep. She knows. She is thinking. Perhaps she is wondering, as I am, about those weakened tendons. She cannot feel them. It is not a matter of pain. It is only a question of how long they will take the strain of speed, the piston pounding of hooves against the hard track, the long way from that excited start to that distant finish. She straightens at the touch of the blacksmith's hand, then yields a foot with graceful resignation. She will do whatever is asked of her, as she always has done. She turns her head, nudging me, speaking to me. "Do not worry, I will run. As long as these legs will bear me up, I will run. But have we long to wait?" "Not long, Wise Child. Not very long." When the blacksmith is finished, I leave the stable and for a few minutes inspect the course again, as if I had not already done it a dozen times. Other trainers and owners stand alone or in pairs about the paddock gates, or lean on the white rails that enclose the oval track. Syces are busy. A jockey wearing the colours of Lady Macmillan's stable scurries through the bustle, an important, a resplendent midget. Bookmakers tread on each other's toes, on mine, on anybody's, or stand flat-footed scowling at scraps of paper clutched like passports to El Dorado. A cloud of people, growing darker, creeps over the course, across the grandstands, muffling in its billows the martial thunder of the KAR band. I feel the filly's legs, a little puffy but not feverish. I kneel down and strap the tendon boots on them firmly, carefully. I slip on the light racing bridle with my blue and gold colours, striping the forehead band. I put the martingale over her head, onto her neck. Arap Ruta fixes the protective pad on her withers, the number cloth over that, and then the saddle. At last I tighten the girths. We do not talk very much. It is only a matter of minutes before the bell will ring, calling the horses to the paddock. Sonny Bumpus has had his instructions. The lean, dark-haired boy has listened earnestly to every word. He is a grand horseman, honest as daylight. I have explained the strategy over and over. Lie 2 or 3 lengths behind Rack for the first couple of furlongs, until the filly gets warmed up. Steady her round the first bend. If her legs are still standing after that, let her go on the far stretch. Get the lead. Keep it. She's willing and fast. She'll stay forever. If Rack challenges, don't worry. So long as her legs can take the drive, she'll never quit. If they fail, well, it won't be your fault. But whatever happens, don't use your whip. If you do, she'll stop in her tracks. That's all. That's all there can be. A bell rings, and I nod to Ruta. He takes Wise Child's reins in his hands and leads her slowly toward the paddock. The small fleck of sweat on her flanks is the only indication that she shares with us our anxiety, our unmentioned fears, and our quiet hopes. It is only coincidence that in the paddock she falls in line behind Rack, giving me a chance to compare them closely. I do not even bother about the others. Lady Macmillan's entries, one of Delamere's, a couple entered by Spencer Tryon, one of the best trainers. They are all good horses, but I admit none as a threat. Wise Child has but 2 threats, Rack and her own weak tendons. Rack is triumphant in advance of victory. He is a beautiful colt, sleek as speed itself, dancing like a boxer on quick, eager feet, flaunting his bright body in front of the steady and demure Wise Child. I look at him and take credit for that impressive form, but allow myself the comfort of small malice at the sight of too much sweat streaming from his chestnut coat, a coat that looks as if it might be otherwise a bit too dry under the touch of experienced fingers. Has Rack been overtrained since he left me? Has someone been too anxious? Or am I smothering reason with a wish? I recognize Rack's owner a few yards down the rail, at the elbow of the colt's new trainer. We nod to each other all around, with about the same warmth one might expect of so many robots. I can't help it. I'll be doubly damned if I will try to help it. Eric Gooch touches my shoulder. I couldn't resist, he says. The filly looks so good I placed a bet on her for myself, and another for you. I won't have to mortgage the old homestead if she loses, but we'll both be a little richer if she wins. Will she? Her legs are weak as oat straws, but she'll try. Rack's the horse. A dogmatic gentleman next to me hurries off to place his bet on Rack. I wince a little, but the man's no fool. Comments are being made on the splendid condition of Wise Child, but the filly is as deaf to flattery as a hitching post. She's deaf to everything. She circles round the paddock before the critical gaze of 500 pairs of eyes. She moves modestly, even shyly, as if her being there at all is a matter she can only hope will be regarded as an excusable error. Suddenly the crowd mumbles and shifts, the paddock opening is cleared, and the lead horse, a black stallion, prances in pompous style toward the track. In a few minutes it will all be over. Eric and I hurry through the grandstand into Delamere's box. We wait, we watch, we brace ourselves against the wooden ledge. The horses canter briskly past the stands. Wise Child with Sonny, riding feather-light, trips like a shy schoolgirl behind the others. She is without ego, but she can afford vanity. There's not a prettier one in the field, nor one more thoughtful. I strain forward, trying foolishly to make her aware of me, to make her feel somehow that the burden of her secret is a little shared, the secret of those smartly bound legs that may have to yield so soon. She's in wonderful shape. Eric is radiant, but there's no answer from me. I unbuckle my binocular case and find that my hands are shaking. She won't win. She can't win. I know Rack's form. I try to be casual, nodding to my friends, fumbling my program as if I could really read it, but the pages are blank. I read nothing. I stand staring down at the little group of horses with humorless anxiety, not as if this were just a race held under the African sun in a noisy settlement between Lake Victoria and the Indian Ocean, but as if this were the greatest race of all time, held on the greatest course with the world looking over my shoulder. Incongruously, the band blares out the nerve-tightening notes of Mandalay, and some of the crowd beat the floorboards in heavy time. I wish the band would stop, and I love bands. I wish people would stop humming that dreary tune, and I love the tune. I can see perfectly well without glasses, but I lift the binoculars to my eyes and watch. They're at the post. Some of them eager, some of them stubborn, some of them not quite sure. Atop their gleaming backs, the jockeys look like gaudy baubles, secured with strings. They bob up and down, they rise, lean forward, then settle again. A horse rears or whirls, striking plumes of dust from the track, until the bright marionette he carries is swallowed in it, but appears again, transformed now, stubbornly human now, controlling, guiding, watching. I find Rack. Look at Rack. He's fighting to run, dying to run. As always, he's impatient with delay. Arrogant devil. He wants it over with. It's his race, and he wants to hammer it into our heads once and for all. Why the ceremony? Why the suspense? Let's run. He's doing a pirouette. He'll plunge if his boy can't hold him. Easy, Rack. Quiet. You elegant fool. The starter is ready. The crowd is ready. Eric and I are ready. The band has stopped, and the grandstand is a tabernacle of silence. This is the moment. This should be the moment. Steady, Sonny. The end may hang on the beginning, you know. Steady, wise child. All right. Everybody on their feet. Everybody crane their necks. Beautiful lineup. Their noses are even as buttons on a tape. Watch the flag. Watch. No. False start. Rack, you idiot. I'd hammer that out of you. I had it out of you once. You can't start that way. You've got to be calm. Don't you remember? You've got... Be calm, says Eric. You're trembling. And so I am. Not quite like a leaf, but anyway like a branch. I don't see how I can help it much, but I turn to Eric and smile vacuously, as if somebody just past 80 had asked me to dance. When I turn again, they're off. With Rack in the lead. That's fine. That's what I expected. It's what the crowd expected too. 5,000 voices, each like a pipe in an immense discordant organ, swell and roll over the single valiant note of the trumpeter. They roll over me, but they sound like a whisper, a bit hoarse, but still like a whisper. I have stopped trembling, almost breathing, I think. I'm calm now, wholly composed. They're off. They're on their way, swinging down the long course, leaving behind their heels a ripple of thunder. How can I compare a race like this to music? Or how can I not? Will some perfectionist snug in the arms of his chair under the marble eyes of Beethoven shudder at the thought? I suppose so. But if there's a fledgling juggler of notes and cadences, less loyal to the stolid past, who seeks a new theme for at least a rhapsody, he may buy a ticket at any gate and see how they run. He will do what I cannot. He will transpose and change and recreate the sound of hooves that pelt like rain, or come like a rolling storm, or taper like the rataplan of fading timpani. He will find the instruments to fit the bellow of a crowd, and notes to voice its silence. He will find rhythm in disorder, and build a crescendo from a sigh. He will find a place for heroic measures if he watches well, and build his climax to a wild beat, and weave the music of excitement in his overtones. A race is not a simple thing. This one is not. There are not just 10 horses down there, galloping as fast as they can. Skill and reason and chance run with them. Courage runs with them, and strategy. You do not watch a race, you read it. There is cause in every flux and change. Jockeys have ability or they haven't. They bungle or they don't. A horse has a heart or he lacks it. Questions must be answered before the rap of one hoof follows another. When to hold back, when to coax, when to maneuver. More speed. All right, but will he last? Who can tell? A good boy, a sound judge of speed, can tell. Slow pace, medium pace, fast pace, which is it? Don't let a second-rater snatch the race. Sonny shouldn't. He's sensitive as a stopwatch. But he might. What's that behind? Trick or challenge? Don't be fooled. Don't be rattled. Don't be hurried. 1 3/4, you know, with 10 in the field and everyone a winner until you prove he's not. There's time. There's time. There's too much time. Time for errors. Time for a lead to be stolen. Time for strength and breath to vanish, time to lose, with the staccato insistence of 40 hooves telling you so. Eyes open. Watch the score. Rack's first, then the black stallion pulling hard. A brown horse with more style than speed clings to a precarious third. It's Wise Child at his flank on the rails. She's smooth. She's leopard smooth. God, she's going well. Eric yells it, and I smile. Be calm, you're trembling. He isn't, perhaps, but he's hopping up and down as if he'd won the race, and he hasn't. He hasn't won anything yet. Tendons, tendons. Remember the tendons. Of course she's going well, but come on, Rack! Support for the enemy, unidentified. I snort and mumble in my mind. Silly man, don't yell, watch. They're in the far stretch now. My jockey's no fool. Sonny's no fool. See that? See, Wise Child, easing up, gliding up. Where's your Rack now? Don't yell. Watch. She's catching him, isn't she? She's closing in, isn't she? She is. She does. The crowd stirs, forgetting bets, and roars for blood. They get it, too. Rack is a picture of driving power. Wise Child, a study in coordination of muscle and bone and nerve. She's fast. She's smooth. She's smooth as a blade. She cuts the daylight between Rack and herself to a hand's breadth, to a hair's breadth, to nothing. Come on, Rack! Die hard, eh? All right, roar again, howl again, but bet again if you can. The filly streaks past the colt like a dust devil past a stone, like a cheetah past a hound. Poor Rack, it will break his heart, but it doesn't. Not Rack's heart. His head is up a little, and I know he's giving all he has, but he gives more. He's a stallion, and the male ego kindles a courage that smothers the pain of his burning muscles. He forgets himself, his jockey, everything but his goal. He lowers his head and thunders after the filly. Without seeing, I know that Eric gives me a quick glance, but I cannot return it. I can only watch the battle. I'm not yet so callous that the gallantry of Rack seems less than magnificent. Gallop, Rack! Faster than you can, harder than you can, my own Rack! My stubborn Rack, 6 lengths behind. But for how long? Wise Child still against the rails, a small shadow against the rails, moving like a shadow, swift as a shadow, determined, quiet, steady. My glasses are on her. Thousands of eyes are on her. When she sways, and the groan from the crowd absorbs my own. The filly swings from the rails and falters. Her legs are going. Her speed is going. Her race is going. Rack's jockey sees it. Rack sees it. The whip smarts against his quarters, but he needs no whip. He closes fast, narrowing the distance length by length. Come on, Rack! The cry is almost barbaric now, and it comes from 100 places. Scream, yell, cheer him on. Can't you see her legs are going? Can't you see she's running only on her heart? Let him have the race. Let him win. Don't push her, Sonny. Don't touch her, Sonny. Eric! But he's gone. He's jumped over the box and run down to the rails. For myself, I can't move. I exist in a cauldron of screams and cheers and waving arms. Rack and the filly are down the last stretch now, and he's on her flank, overtaking her, passing her, shaming her, while she breaks. My glasses dangle on their strap. I bend over the edge of the box, clamping my fingers on the wooden ledge. I can't shout or think. I know this is only a horse race. I know that tomorrow will be the same as yesterday, whoever loses. I know the world won't turn a hair, whoever wins. But it seems so hard to believe. I suppose for an instant I'm in a trance. My eyes see everything but register nothing, not a noise. But the sudden hush of the crowd jars me to consciousness again. How long is an instant? Could it be long enough for this? I see it happen, clearly, sharply, as a camera must see things happen. I'm as cold and bloodless, as rigid, too, I think. I see Wise Child falter once more and then straighten. I see her transformed from the shadow she was to a small, swift flame of valor that throws my doubt in my teeth. I see her scorn the threat of Rack and cram the cheers for his supporters back in their throats. I see her sweep the final furlong on swollen legs, forging ahead, feeding him the dust of her hooves, and I hear the crowd find its voice again, hurling her past the winning post in a towering roar of tribute. And then it's over. Then it's silent, as if somebody closed the door on babble. I feel my way down to the unsaddling enclosure. A grey mass of people clings to the rails. A foggy, but articulate jungle of arms, heads, and shoulders surrounding the winner, chanting, mumbling, shifting. They stare, but I think they see nothing. They see only a bay filly, standing quietly, with quiet eyes. And that is nothing. That is ordinary. It can be seen anywhere, a bay filly that won a race. The crowd dwindles as I talk to Eric, to Sonny, to Arap Ruta, and stroke the still sweating neck of Wise Child. The movement of my hand is mechanical, almost senseless. She didn't just win, Eric says. She broke the Léger record. I nod without saying anything, and Eric looks at me with kindly impatience. Weighing out of the jockeys is finished, everything is over, and the last notes of the band have whimpered into silence. All the people press toward the gates, the emblems of their holiday litter the course, or scamper in a listless dance before the wind. Half the grandstand lies in a shadow, and the other half is lit with the sun. It is like a pod, emptied of its seeds. Eric takes me by the arm, and we jostle toward the exit with the rest. She broke the record. And with those legs, says Eric. I know. You told me. So I did. He walks along, scuffling the ground, and scratches his chin in a masculine effort not to look sentimental, a futile effort. But at least he can inject a note of gruffness into his voice. Maybe it's silly, he says, but I know you'll agree that no matter how much money we could make with Wise Child, she deserves never to race again. And she never does. Birth of a life. We began at the first hour of the morning. We began when the sky was clean and ready for the sun, and you could see your breath and smell traces of the night. We began every morning at that same hour, using what we were pleased to call the Nairobi Airdrome, climbing away from it with derisive clamour, while the burghers of the town twitched in their beds and dreamed, perhaps, of all unpleasant things that drone, of wings and stings, and corridors in Bedlam. Tom taught me in a D.H. gypsy moth at first, and her propeller beat the sunrise silence of the Ati plains to shreds and scraps. We swung over the hills and over the town and back again, and I saw how a man can be master of a craft, and how a craft can be master of an element. I saw the alchemy of perspective reduce my world and all my other life to grains in a cup. I learned to watch, to put my trust in other hands than mine, and I learned to wander. I learned what every dreaming child needs to know, that no horizon is so far that you cannot get above it or beyond it. These I learned at once, but most things came harder. Tom Black had never taught another soul to fly, and the things he had to teach beyond the simple mechanics that go with flying are those things that have not lent themselves to words. Intuition and instinct are mysteries still, though precisely spelled or rolled precisely off the tongue. Tom had these, or whatever qualities they signify. After this era of great pilots is gone, as the era of great sea captains has gone, each nudged aside by the march of inventive genius, by steel cogs and copper discs and hair-thin wires on white faces that are dumb but speak, it will be found, I think, that all the science of flying has been captured in the breadth of an instrument board, but not the religion of it. One day the stars will be as familiar to each man as the landmarks, the curves, and the hills on the road that leads to his door, and one day this will be an airborne life. But by then, men will have forgotten how to fly. They will be passengers on machines whose conductors are carefully promoted to a familiarity with labelled buttons, and in whose minds knowledge of the sky and the wind and the way of weather will be extraneous as passing fiction. And the days of the clipper ships will be recalled again, and people will wonder if clipper means ancients of the sea or ancients of the air. Trust this, said Tom, but nothing else. He meant the compass. Instruments can go wrong, he said. If you can't fly without looking at your airspeed and your altimeter and your bank and turn indicator, well, then you can't fly. You're like somebody who only knows what he thinks after reading his newspaper. But don't mistrust the compass. Your judgment will never be more accurate than that needle. It will tell you where you ought to be going, and the rest is up to you." There were earphones in the Gypsy Moth, but Tom never used them. While I sat in the rear cockpit, a fumbling beginner, apprehensive and wondering how my hands, so used to strips of leather, and my feet, so used to stirrups, would ever get used to this, Tom might have eased the task a little by talking into those earphones, but he never would. He rolled them up and put them in a corner out of reach. He said, "It's no good my telling you where you go wrong each time you do. Your own intelligence will tell you that. Speed, sense of height, and sense of error will come later. If they don't, well, but they will." That they did was due to him. There was never a more careful pilot, nor yet a more casual one. His confidence never shrank beside the bullying roar of a plane. He wasn't a tall man, but he had a quiet, convincing manner that made him look bigger than any job he ever held, and more capable than any craft he ever flew. Wilson Airways, the first commercial enterprise of its kind in East Africa, had been the child of Tom's imagination and foresight. When he undertook to teach me to fly, he was managing director, chief pilot, and guiding spirit of the hopeful little company. But the somewhat pompous executive title had nothing to do with polished desks and swivel chairs. Tom's job was to pioneer new routes, to probe inland Africa, seeking footholds for the future. More often than not, he took off from Nairobi, flying over country as unused to wheels as it was to wings, with no more than a modest expectation that there might be some place to land at the end of his flight. And not all of this was done by daylight. He flew without beams, without beacons or radio, through whatever darkness the night could offer, and through whatever weather. There was rarely a light of a village for guidance, nor any highways, nor rails, nor wires, nor farms. He did not call it blind flying, he called it night flying. Though when fog or storm required it of him, he flew blind for hours, without special instruments, yet not failing on his course. He had what those thick books with dull grey covers call sensory reaction. We flew down into Tanganyika once, just after I'd got my A license, and it may have been that I was a bit full of the sense of achievement, or if I wasn't, Tom suspected that I might be. Near the end of the return trip, flying north toward the Ngong Hills over the Rift Valley, the Gypsy Moth was afflicted with a strange lethargy. I was at the controls, and as the hills, which rise about 8,000 feet above sea level, came closer so that their ravines and green slopes emerged from the lazy haze they live in, I opened the throttle and drew back the stick for altitude. But it seemed there wasn't any more. The little plane was doing a respectable 80 miles an hour, hardly record speed even then, but still fast enough to make me appreciate the sad and final consequences of not getting over that close horizon. As I blundered on, the trees of the Ngong Hills began to separate one from another, to stand out individually, even magnificently. The ravines got deeper, more stick, more throttle. I was calm. Most beginners, I thought, might have got a bit rattled, but not I, certainly not Tom. He sat in front of me, motionless as a drowsing man. You can open a throttle just so far and increase the angle of a joystick to just such a degree, and if your plane does not respond to this, you had better think of something else. The Moth was not gaining altitude. She was losing that and her speed. She was heading straight for the implacable hills, like a moth hypnotized by light. There was a weight on her wings that I could feel bearing her down. She could not lift the weight. Tom must have felt it, but he never moved. When you can see the branches of trees from a cockpit, and the shape of rocks no bigger than your own hands, and places where grass thins against sand and becomes yellow, and watch the blow of wind on leaves, you are too close. You are so close that thought is a slow process, useless to you now, even if you can think. The sound of our propeller got trapped between a wall of rock and the plane before Tom straightened in his seat and took the controls. He banked sharply, dusting the trees and rock with blue exhaust. He put the nose of the gypsy down and swung her deep into the valley, while her shadow rode close on the hill. He lost altitude until the valley was flat. He climbed in spirals until we were high above the Ngong Hills, and he went over them and home. It was all so simple. "Now you know what downdraft is," said Tom. "You get it near mountains, and in Africa it's common as rain. I could have warned you, but you shouldn't be robbed of your right to make mistakes." It was a right he protected as long as we flew together, so that in the end I never did anything in a plane without knowing what might have happened if I had done some other thing. I may have to shoot him. I suppose if there were a part of the world in which mastodons still lived, somebody would design a new gun, and men, in their eternal impudence, would hunt mastodon as they now hunt elephant. Impudence seems to be the word. At least David and Goliath were of the same species, but to an elephant, a man can only be a midge with a deathly sting. It is absurd for a man to kill an elephant. It is not brutal, it is not heroic, and certainly it is not easy. It is just one of those preposterous things that men do, like putting a dam across a great river, 1/10 of whose volume could engulf the whole of mankind, without disturbing the domestic life of a single catfish. Elephant, beyond the fact that their size and conformation are aesthetically more suited to the treading of this earth than our angular informity, have an average intelligence comparable to our own. Of course, they are less agile and physically less adaptable than ourselves, nature having developed their bodies in one direction and their brains in another, while human beings, on the other hand, drew from Mr. Darwin's lottery of evolution both the winning ticket and the stub to match it. This, I suppose, is why we are so wonderful, and can make movies and electric razors and wireless sets and guns with which to shoot the elephant, the hare, clay pigeons, and each other. The elephant is a rational animal. He thinks. Blix and I, also rational animals in our own right, have never quite agreed on the mental attributes of the elephant. I know Blix is not to be doubted, because he has learned more about elephant than any other man I ever met, or even heard about. But he looks upon legend with a suspicious eye, and I do not. There is a legend that elephant dispose of their dead in secret burial grounds, and that none of these has ever been discovered. In support of this, there is only the fact that the body of an elephant, unless he had been trapped or shot in his tracks, has rarely been found. What happens to the old and diseased? Not only natives, but many white settlers have supported for years the legend, if it is legend, that elephant will carry their wounded and their sick hundreds of miles, if necessary, to keep them out of the hands of their enemies, and it is said that elephant never forget. These are perhaps just stories born of imagination. Ivory was once almost as precious as gold, and wherever there is treasure, men mix it with mystery. But still there is no mystery about the things you see yourself. I think I am the first person ever to scout elephant by plane, and so it follows that the thousands of elephant I saw time and again from the air had never before been plagued by anything above their heads more ominous than tick birds. The reaction of a herd of elephant to my avion was, in the initial instance, always the same. They left their feeding ground and tried to find cover, though often before yielding, one or two of the bulls would prepare for battle and charge in the direction of the plane if it were low enough to be within their scope of vision. Once the futility of this was realized, the entire herd would be off into the deepest bush. Checking again on the whereabouts of the same herd next day, I always found that a good deal of thinking had been going on amongst them during the night. On the basis of their reaction to my second intrusion, I judged that their thoughts had run somewhat like this. A. The thing that flew over us was no bird, since no bird would have to work so hard to stay in the air, and anyway, we know all the birds. B. If it was no bird, it was very likely just another trick of those two-legged dwarfs, against whom there ought to be a law. C. The two-legged dwarfs, both black and white, have, as long as our long memories go back, killed our bulls for their tusks. We know this because, in the case of the white dwarfs, at least, the tusks are the only part taken away. The actions of the elephant, based upon this reasoning, were always sensible and practical. The second time they saw the avian, they refused to hide. Instead, the females, who bear only small, valueless tusks, simply grouped themselves around their treasure-burdened bulls in such a way that no ivory could be seen from the air or from any other approach. This can be maddening strategy to an elephant scout. I have spent the better part of an hour circling, crisscrossing, and diving low over some of the most inhospitable country in Africa in an effort to break such a stubborn huddle, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. But the tactics vary. More than once I have come upon a large and solitary elephant standing with enticing disregard for safety, its massive bulk in clear view, but its head buried in thicket. This was, on the part of the elephant, no effort to simulate the nonsensical habit attributed to the ostrich. It was, on the contrary, a cleverly devised trap into which I fell, every way except physically, at least a dozen times. The beast always proved to be a large cow rather than a bull, and I always found that by the time I had arrived at this brilliant, if tardy, deduction, the rest of the herd had got another 10 miles away. And the decoy, leering up at me out of a small, triumphant eye, would amble into the open, wave her trunk with devastating nonchalance, and disappear. This order of intelligence in a lesser animal can obviously give rise to exaggeration, some of it persistent enough to be crystallized into legend, but you cannot discredit truth merely because legend has grown out of it. The sometimes almost godlike achievements of our own species in ages past toddle through history, supported more often than not on the twin crutches of fable and human credulity. As to the brutality of elephant hunting, I cannot see that it is any more brutal than 90% of all other human activities. I suppose there is nothing more tragic about the death of an elephant than there is about the death of a Hereford steer, certainly not in the eyes of the steer. The only difference is that the steer has neither the ability nor the chance to outwit the gentleman who wields the slaughterhouse snickersnee, while the elephant has both of these to pit against the hunter. Elephant hunters may be unconscionable brutes, but it would be an error to regard the elephant as an altogether pacific animal. The popular belief that only the so-called rogue elephant is dangerous to men is quite wrong, so wrong that a considerable number of men who believed it have become one with the dust without even their just due of gradual disintegration. A normal bull elephant, aroused by the scent of man, will often attack at once, and his speed is as unbelievable as his mobility. His trunk and his feet are his weapons, at least in the distasteful business of exterminating a mere human. Those resplendent sabres of ivory await resplendent foes. Blix and I hardly came into this category at Killimacoy, certainly not after we had run down the big bull, or, as it happened, the big bull had run down us. I can say at once, with gratification still genuine, that we were not trampled within that most durable of all inches, the last inch of our lives. We got out all right, but there are times when I still dream. On arriving from Makindu, I landed my plane in the shallow box of a runway, scooped out of the bush, unplugged wads of cotton wool from my ears, and climbed from the cockpit. The aristocratically descended visage of the Baron von Blixen-Finecke greeted me, as it always did, with the most delightful of smiles, caught, like a strip of sunlight, on a familiar patch of leather, well-kept leather, free of wrinkles, but brown and saddle-tough. Beyond this concession to the fictional idea of what a white hunter ought to look like, Blix's face yields not a whit. He has gay, light blue eyes rather than sombre, steel-grey ones. His cheeks are well-rounded rather than flat as an axe. His lips are full and generous and not pinched tight in grim realization of what the wilderness can do. He talks. He is never significantly silent. He wore then what I always remember him as wearing, a khaki bush shirt of solario material, slacks of the same stuff, and a pair of low-cut moccasins with soles, or at least vestiges of soles. There were 4 pockets in his bush shirt, but I don't think he knew it. He never carried anything unless he was actually hunting, and then it was just a rifle and ammunition. He never went around hung with knives, revolvers, binoculars, or even a watch. He could tell time by the sun, and if there were no sun, he could tell it anyway. He wore over his closely cropped greying hair a tarai hat, colourless and limp as a wilted frond. He said, "Hullo, Beryl," and pointed to a man at his side, so angular as to give the impression of being constructed entirely of barrel staves. "This," said Blix, with what could hardly be called old-world courtesy, "is Old Man Wicks." "At last," said Old Man Wicks, "I have seen the lady from the skies." Writing it now, that remark seems a little like a line from the best play chosen from those offered by the graduating class of Eton, possibly in the late 20s, or like the remark of a man up to his ears in his favourite anodyne. But, as a matter of fact, Old Man Wicks, who managed a piece of no-man's land belonging to the Mononi Sugar Company, near the Masongeleni, had seen only one white man in 16 months, and, I gathered, hadn't seen a white woman in as many years. At least he had never seen an airplane and a white woman at the same time, nor can I be sure that he regarded the spectacle as much of a godsend. Old Man Wicks, oddly enough, wasn't very old. He was barely 40, and it may have been that his monkish life was the first choice of whatever other lives he could have led. He looked old, but that might have been protective coloration. He was a gentle, kindly man, helping Blix with the safari until Winston Guest arrived. It was a modest enough safari. There were 3 large tents, Winston's, Blix's, and my own, and then there were several pup tents for the native boys, gun-bearers, and trackers. Blix's boy Farah, Winston's boy, and of course my Arap Ruta, who was due via lorry from Nairobi, had pup tents to themselves. The others, as much out of choice as necessity, slept several in a tent. There was a hangar for the avian, made out of a square of tarpaulin, and there was a baobab tree, whose shade served as a veranda to everybody. The immediate country was endless and barren of hills. Half an hour after I landed, Blix and I were up in the avian, hoping, if possible, to spot a herd of elephant before Winston's arrival that night. If we could find a herd within 2 or 3 days' walking distance from the camp, it would be extraordinary luck, always provided that the herd contained a bull with respectable tusks. It is not unusual for an elephant hunter to spend 6 months or even a year on the spoor of a single bull. Elephant go where men can't, or at least shouldn't. Scouting by plane eliminates a good deal of the preliminary work, but when, as upon occasion, I did spot a herd not more than 30 or 40 miles from camp, it still meant that those 40 miles had to be walked, crawled, or wriggled by the hunters, and that by the time this body and nerve-wracking maneuver had been achieved, the elephant had pushed on another 20 miles or so into the bush. A man, it ought to be remembered, has to take several steps to each stride of an elephant, and moreover the man is somewhat less than resistant to thicket, thorn trees, and heat. Also, particularly if he is white, he is vulnerable as a peeled egg to all things that sting. Anopheles, mosquitoes, scorpions, snakes, and tsetse flies. The essence of elephant hunting is discomfort in such lavish proportions that only the wealthy can afford it. Blix and I were fortunate on our very first expedition out of Kilimakoy. The Wakamba scouts on our safari had reported a large herd of elephant, containing several worthwhile bulls, not more than 20 air miles from camp. We circled the district indicated, passed over the herd perhaps a dozen times, but finally spotted it. A herd of elephant, as seen from a plane, has a quality of an hallucination. The proportions are wrong. They are like those of a child's drawing of a field mouse, in which the whole landscape, complete with barns and windmills, is dwarfed beneath the whiskers of the mighty rodent, who looks both able and willing to devour everything, including the thumbtack that holds the work against the schoolroom wall. Peering down from the cockpit at grazing elephant, you have the feeling that what you are beholding is wonderful, but not authentic. It is not only incongruous in the sense that animals simply are not as big as trees, but also in the sense that the 20th century, tidy and svelte with stainless steel as it is, would not possibly permit such prehistoric monsters to wander in its garden. Even in Africa, the elephant is as anomalous as the Cro-Magnon man might be, shooting a round of golf at St. Andrews in Scotland. But with all this, elephant are seldom conspicuous from the air. If they were smaller, they might be. Big as they are, and coloured as they are, they blend with everything until the moment they catch your eye. They caught Blix's eye, and he scribbled me a frantic note. "Look, the big bull is enormous. Turn back. Dr. Turvey radios I should have some gin." Well, we had no radio, and certainly no gin in my plane, but just as certainly we had Dr. Turvey. Dr. Turvey was an ethereal citizen of an ethereal world. In the beginning he existed only for Blix, but long before the end he existed for everybody who worked with Blix or knew him well. Although Dr. Turvey's prescriptions indicated that he put his trust in a wine list rather than a pharmacopoeia, he had two qualities of special excellence in a physician. His diagnosis was always arrived at in a split second, and he held the complete confidence of his patient. Beyond that, his adeptness at mental telepathy, in which Blix himself was pretty well grounded, eliminated the expensive practice of calling round to feel the pulse or take a temperature. Nobody ever saw Dr. Turvey, and that fact, Blix insisted, was bedside manner carried to its final degree of perfection. I banked the avian and turned toward camp. Within 3 miles of our communal baobab tree, we saw 4 more elephant, 3 of them beautiful bulls. The thought passed through my head that the way to find a needle in a haystack is to sit down. Elephant are never within 3 miles of camp. It's hardly cricket that they should be. It doesn't make a hunter out of you to turn over on your canvas cot and realize that the thing you are hunting at such expense and physical tribulation is so contemptuous of your prowess as to be eating leaves right in front of your eyes. But Blix is a practical man. As a white hunter, his job was to produce the game desired and to point it out to his employer of the moment. Blix's work and mine was made much easier by finding the elephants so close. We could even land at the camp and then approach them on foot to judge more accurately their size, immediate intentions, and strategic disposition. Dr. Turvey's prescription had to be filled and taken, of course, but even so we would have time to reconnoitre. We landed on the miserly runway, which had a lot in common with an extemporaneous badminton court, and within 20 minutes proceeded on foot toward those magnificent bulls. Makula was with us. Neither the safari nor this book, for that matter, could be complete without Makula. Though there are a good many Wakamba trackers available in East Africa, it has become almost traditional in late years to mention Makula in every book that touches upon elephant hunting, and I would not break with tradition. Makula is a man in the peculiar position of having gained fame without being aware of it. He can neither read nor write. His first language is Wakamba, his second a halting Swahili. He is a smallish, ebon-tinted native, with an inordinately wise eye, a penchant for black magic, and the instincts of a beagle hound. I think he could track a honeybee through a bamboo forest. No matter how elaborate the safari on which Makula is engaged as tracker, he goes about naked from the waist up, carrying a long bow and a quiver full of poisoned arrows. He has seen the work of the best rifles white men have yet produced, but when Makula's nostrils distend after either a good or a bad shot, it is not the smell of gunpowder that distends them. It is a kind of restrained contempt for that noisy and unwieldy piece of machinery, with its devilish tendency to knock the untutored huntsman flat on his buttocks every time he pulls the trigger. Safaris come and safaris go, but Makula goes on forever. I suspect at times that he is one of the wisest men I have ever known, so wise that, realizing the scarcity of wisdom, he has never cast a scrap of it away, though I still remember a remark he made to an overzealous newcomer to his profession. "White men pay for danger." We poor ones cannot afford it. Find your elephant, then vanish, so that you may live to find another." Makula always vanished. He went ahead in the bush with the silence of a shade, missing nothing, and the moment he had brought his hunters within sight of the elephant, he disappeared with the silence of a shade, missing everything. Stalking just ahead of Blix through the tight bush, Makula signaled for a pause, shinned up a convenient tree without noise, and then came down again. He pointed to a chink in the thicket, took Blix firmly by the arm, and pushed him ahead. Then Makula disappeared. Blix led, and I followed. The ability to move soundlessly through a wall of bush as tightly woven as nature can weave it is not an art that can be acquired much after childhood. I cannot explain it. Nor could Arap Maina, who taught me, ever explain it. It is not a matter of watching where you step. It is rather a matter of keeping your eyes on the place where you want to be, while every nerve becomes another eye, every muscle develops reflex action. You do not guide your body, you trust it to be silent. We were silent. The elephant we advanced upon heard nothing, even when the enormous hindquarters of two bulls loomed before us like grey rocks wedded to the earth. Blix stopped. He whispered with his fingers, and I read the whisper. "Watch the wind. Swing round them. I want to see their tusks." Swing, indeed. It took us slightly over an hour to negotiate a semicircle of 50 yards. The bulls were big, with ivory enough, 100-pounders at least, or better. Nimrod was satisfied, wet with sweat, and on the verge, I sensed, of receiving a psychic message from Dr. Turvey. But this message was delayed in transit. One bull raised his head, elevated his trunk, and moved to face us. His gargantuan ears began to spread as if to capture even the sound of our heartbeats. By chance he had grazed over a spot we had lately left, and he had got our scent. It was all he needed. I have rarely seen anything so calm as that bull-elephant, or so casually determined upon destruction. It might be said that he shuffled to the kill. Being, like all elephant, almost blind, this one could not see us, but he was used to that. He would follow scent and sound until he could see us, which I computed would take about 30 seconds. Blix wiggled his fingers earthward, and that meant drop and crawl. It is amazing what a lot of insect life goes on under your nose when you've got it an inch from the earth. I suppose it goes on in any case, but if you are proceeding on your stomach, dragging your body along by your fingernails, entomology presents itself very forcibly as a thoroughly justified science. The problem of classification alone must continue to be very discouraging. By the time I had crawled 3 feet, I am sure that somewhere over 50 distinct species of insect life were individually and severally represented in my clothes, with siafu ants conducting the congress. Blix's feet were just ahead of my eyes, close enough so that I could contemplate the holes in his shoes and wonder why he ever wore any at all, since he went through them almost in a matter of hours. I had ample time also to observe that he wore no socks, practical but not comme il faut. His legs moved through the underbrush like dead legs dragged by strings. There was no sound from the elephant. I don't know how long we crawled like that, but the little shadows in the thicket were leaning toward the east when we stopped. Possibly we had gone 100 yards. The insect bites had become just broad, burning patches. We were breathing easier, or at least I was, when Blix's feet and legs went motionless. I could just see his head close against his shoulder and watch him turn to peek upward into the bush. He gave no signal to continue. He only looked horribly embarrassed, like a child caught stealing eggs. But my own expression must have been a little more intense. The big bull was about 10 feet away, and at that distance elephant are not blind. Blix stood up and raised his rifle slowly, with an expression of ineffable sadness. That's for me, I thought. He knows that even a shot in the brain won't stop that bull before we're both crushed like mangoes. In an open place it might have been possible to dodge to one side, but not here. I stood behind Blix with my hands on his waist according to his instructions, but I knew it wasn't any good. The body of the elephant was swaying. It was like watching a boulder in whose path you were trapped teeter on the edge of a cliff before plunging. The bull's ears were spread wide now. His trunk was up and extended toward us, and he began the elephant's scream of anger, which is so terrifying as to hold you silent where you stand, like fingers clamped upon your throat. It's a shrill scream, cold as winter wind. It occurred to me that this was the instant to shoot. Blix never moved. He held his rifle very steady and began to chant some of the most striking blasphemy I have ever heard. It was colourful, original, and delivered with finesse, but I felt that this was a badly chosen moment to test it on an elephant, and ungallant beyond belief if it was meant for me. The elephant advanced. Blix unleashed more oaths, this time in Swedish, and I trembled. There was no rifle shot. A single biscuit tin, I judged, would do for both of us. Cremation would be superfluous. "I may have to shoot him," Blix announced, and the remark struck me as an understatement of classic magnificence. Bullets would sink into that monstrous hide like pebbles into a pond. Somehow you never think of an elephant as having a mouth, because you never see it when his trunk is down, so that when the elephant is quite close and his trunk is up, the dark red and black slit is by way of being an almost shocking revelation. I was looking into our elephant's mouth with a kind of idiotic curiosity when he screamed again, and thereby, I am convinced, saved both Blix and me from a fate no more tragic than simple death, but infinitely less tidy. The scream of that elephant was a strategic blunder, and it did him out of a wonderful bit of fun. It was such an authentic scream, of such splendid resonance, that his cronies, still grazing in the bush, accepted it as legitimate warning and left. We had known they were still there because the bowels of peacefully occupied elephant rumble continually like oncoming thunder, and we had heard thunder. They left, and it seemed they tore the country from its roots in leaving. Everything went, bush, trees, sansevieria, clods of dirt, and the monster who confronted us. He paused, listened, and swung round with the slow irresistibility of a bank vault door, and then he was off in a typhoon of crumpled vegetation and crashing trees. For a long time there wasn't any silence, but when there was, Blix lowered his rifle, which had acquired for me all the death-dealing qualities of a feather duster. I was limp, irritable, and full of maledictions for the insect kind. Blix and I hacked our way back to camp without the exchange of a word, but when I fell into a canvas chair in front of the tents, I forswore the historic propriety of my sex to ask a rude question. "I think you're the best hunter in Africa, Blicky, but there are times when your humor is gruesome. Why in hell didn't you shoot?" Blix extracted a bug from Dr. Turvey's elixir of life and shrugged. "Don't be silly. You know as well as I do why I didn't shoot. Those elephant are for Winston." "Of course I know. But what if that bull had charged?" Farah the faithful produced another drink, and Blix produced a non sequitur. He stared upward into the leaves of the baobab tree, and sighed like a poet in love. "There's an old adage," he said, translated from the ancient Coptic, that contains all the wisdom of the ages. "Life is life, and fun is fun. But it's all so quiet when the goldfish die." West with the night. I have seldom dreamed a dream worth dreaming again, or at least none worth recording. Mine are not enigmatic dreams. They are peopled with characters who are plausible and who do plausible things, and I am the most plausible amongst them. All the characters in my dreams have quiet voices, like the voice of the man who telephoned me at Elstree one morning in September of 1936, and told me that there was rain and strong headwinds over the west of England and over the Irish Sea, and that there were variable winds and clear skies in mid-Atlantic, and fog off the coast of Newfoundland.
"If you are still determined to fly the Atlantic this late in the year," the voice said, "the Air Ministry suggests that the weather it is able to forecast for tonight and for tomorrow morning will be about the best you can expect." The voice had a few other things to say, but not many, and then it was gone, and I lay in bed half suspecting that the telephone call and the man who made it were only parts of the mediocre dream I had been dreaming. I felt that if I closed my eyes, the unreal quality of the message would be re-established, and that when I opened them again, this would be another ordinary day with its usual beginning and its usual routine. But of course I could not close my eyes, nor my mind, nor my memory. I could lie there for a few moments, remembering how it had begun, and telling myself with senseless repetition that by tomorrow morning I should either have flown the Atlantic to America, or I should not have flown it. In either case, this was the day I would try. I could stare up at the ceiling of my bedroom in Aldenham House, which was a ceiling undistinguished as ceilings go, and feel less resolute than anxious, much less brave than foolhardy. I could say to myself, "You needn't do it, of course," knowing at the same time that nothing is so inexorable as a promise to your pride. I could ask, "Why risk it?" as I have been asked since, and I could answer, "Each to his element. By his nature a sailor must sail, by his nature a flyer must fly." I could compute that I had flown 250,000 miles, and I could foresee that, so long as I had a plane and the sky was there, I should go on flying more miles. There was nothing extraordinary in this. I had learned a craft, and had worked hard learning it. My hands had been taught to seek the controls of a plane. Usage had taught them. They were at ease clinging to a stick, as a cobbler's fingers are in repose, grasping an awl. No human pursuit achieves dignity until it can be called work, and when you can experience a physical loneliness for the tools of your trade, you see that the other things, the experiments, the irrelevant vocations, the vanities you used to hold, were false to you. Record flights had actually never interested me very much for myself. There were people who thought that such flights were done for admiration and publicity, and worse. But of all the records, from Louis Blériot's first crossing of the English Channel in 1909, through and beyond Kingsford Smith's flight from San Francisco to Sydney, Australia, none had been made by amateurs, nor by novices, nor by men or women less than hardened to failure, or less than masters of their trade. None of these was false. They were a company that simple respect and simple ambition made it worth more than an effort to follow. The Carberrys of Surami were in London, and I could remember everything about their dinner party, even the menu. I could remember June Carberry and all her guests, and the man named McCarthy, who lived in Zanzibar, leaning across the table and saying, "J.C., why don't you finance Beryl for a record flight?" I could lie there staring lazily at the ceiling and recall J.C.'s dry answer. "A number of pilots have flown the North Atlantic west to east. Only Jim Mollison has done it alone the other way from Ireland. Nobody has done it alone from England, man or woman. I'd be interested in that, but nothing else. If you want to try it, Beryl, I'll back you. I think Edgar Percival could build a plane that would do it, provided you can fly it. Want to chance it?" Yes. I could remember saying that, better than I could remember anything, except J.C.'s almost ghoulish grin and his remark that sealed the agreement. "It's a deal, Beryl. I'll furnish the plane and you fly the Atlantic. Ha ha, but gee, ha ha ha, I wouldn't tackle it for $1,000,000. Think of all that black water. Think how cold it is." And I had thought of both. I had thought of both for a while, and then there had been other things to think about. I had moved to Elstree, half-hour's flight from the Percival Aircraft Works at Gravesend, and almost daily for 3 months now I had flown down to the factory in a hired plane and watched the Vega Gull they were making for me. I had watched her birth and watched her growth. I had watched her wings take shape and seen wood and fabric moulded to her ribs to form her long, sleek belly, and I had seen her engine cradled into her frame and made fast. The Gull had a turquoise-blue body and silver wings. Edgar Percival had made her with care, with skill, and with worry, the care of a veteran flyer, the skill of a master designer, and the worry of a friend. Actually, the plane was a standard sport model with a range of only 660 miles, but she had a special undercarriage built to carry the weight of her extra oil and petrol tanks. The tanks were fixed into the wings, into the center section, and into the cabin itself. In the cabin they formed a wall around my seat, and each tank had a petcock of its own. The petcocks were important. "If you open one," said Percival, "without shutting the other first, you may get an airlock. You know, the tanks in the cabin have no gauges, so it may be best to let one run completely dry before opening the next. Your motor might go dead in the interval, but she'll start again. She's a de Havilland gypsy, and gypsies never stop." I had talked to Tom. We had spent hours going over the Atlantic chart, and I had realized that the Tinker of Molo, now one of England's great pilots, had traded his dreams and had got in return a better thing. Tom had grown older too. He had jettisoned a dead weight of irrelevant hopes and wonders, and had left himself a realistic code that had no room for temporizing or easy sentiment. "I'm glad you're going to do it, Beryl. It won't be simple. If you can get off the ground in the first place with such an immense load of fuel, you'll be alone in that plane about a night and a day, mostly night. Doing it east to west, the wind's against you. In September, so is the weather. You won't have a radio. If you misjudge your course only a few degrees, you'll end up in Labrador in the sea. So don't misjudge anything." Tom could still grin. He had grinned, and he had said, "Anyway, it ought to amuse you to think that your financial backer lives on a farm called the Place of Death, and your plane is being built at Gravesend. If you were consistent, you'd christen the Gull the Flying Tombstone." I hadn't been that consistent. I had watched the building of the plane, and I had trained for the flight like an athlete, and now as I lay in bed fully awake, I could still hear the quiet voice of the man from the Air Ministry intoning, like the voice of a dispassionate court clerk, "The weather for tonight and tomorrow will be about the best you can expect." I should have liked to discuss the flight once more with Tom before I took off, but he was on a special job up north. I got out of bed and bathed, and put on my flying clothes, and took some cold chicken packed in a cardboard box, and flew over to the military field at Abingdon, where the Vega Gull waited for me under the care of the RAF. I remember that the weather was clear and still. Jim Mollison lent me his watch. He said, "This is not a gift. I wouldn't part with it for anything. It got me across the North Atlantic and the South Atlantic too. Don't lose it. And for God's sake, don't get it wet. Salt water would ruin the works." Brian Lewis gave me a life-saving jacket. Brian owned the plane I had been using between Elstree and Gravesend, and he had thought a long time about a farewell gift. What could be more practical than a pneumatic jacket that could be inflated through a rubber tube? "You could float around in it for days," said Brian. But I had to decide between the lifesaver and warm clothes. I couldn't have both because of their bulk, and I hate the cold, so I left the jacket. And Jock Cameron, Brian's mechanic, gave me a sprig of heather. If it had been a whole bush of heather, complete with roots growing in an earthen jar, I think I should have taken it, bulky or not. The blessing of Scotland bestowed by a Scotsman is not to be dismissed, nor is the well-wishing of a ground mechanic to be taken lightly, for these men are the pilot's contact with reality. "Here is a sprig of heather," said Jock, and I took it and pinned it into a pocket of my flying jacket. There were press cars parked outside the field at Abingdon, and several press planes and photographers, but the RAF kept everyone away from the grounds, except technicians and a few of my friends. The Carberrys had sailed for New York a month ago to wait for me there. Tom was still out of reach with no knowledge of my decision to leave, but that didn't matter so much, I thought. It didn't matter because Tom was unchanging, neither a fair-weather pilot nor a fair-weather friend. If for a month or a year or 2 years we sometimes had not seen each other, it still hadn't mattered. Nor did this. Tom would never say, "You should have let me know." He assumed that I had learned all that he had tried to teach me, and for my part I thought of him even then as the merest student must think of his mentor. I could sit in a cabin overcrowded with petrol tanks and set my course for North America, but the knowledge of my hands on the controls would be Tom's knowledge. His words of caution and words of guidance spoke so long ago, so many times, on bright mornings over the veldt or over a forest, or with a far mountain visible at the tip of our wing, would be spoken again if I asked. So it didn't matter, I thought. It was silly to think about. The abhorrence of loneliness is as natural as wanting to live at all. If it were otherwise, men would never have bothered to make an alphabet, nor to have fashioned words out of what were only animal sounds, nor to have crossed continents, each man to see what the other looked like. Being alone in an aeroplane for even so short a time as a night and a day, irrevocably alone, with nothing to observe but your instruments and your own hands in semi-darkness, nothing to contemplate but the size of your small courage, nothing to wonder about but the beliefs, the faces, and the hopes rooted in your mind. Such an experience can be as startling as the first awareness of a stranger walking by your side at night. You are the stranger. It is dark already, and I am over the south of Ireland. There are the lights of Cork, and the lights are wet, they are drenched in Irish rain, and I am above them and dry. I am above them, and the plane roars in a sobbing world, but it imparts no sadness to me. I feel the security of solitude, the exhilaration of escape. So long as I can see the lights and imagine the people walking under them, I feel selfishly triumphant, as if I have eluded care and left even the small sorrow of rain in other hands. It is a little over an hour now since I left Abingdon. England, Wales, and the Irish Sea are behind me like so much time used up. On a long flight, distance and time are the same. But there had been a moment when time stopped, and distance too. It was the moment I lifted the blue and silver Gull from the airdrome, the moment the photographers aimed their cameras, the moment I felt the craft refuse its burden and strain toward the earth in sullen rebellion, only to listen at last to the persuasion of stick and elevators, the dogmatic argument of blueprints that said she had to fly because the figures proved it. So she had flown, and once airborne, once she had yielded to the sophistry of a draftsman's board, she had said, "There, I have lifted the weight. Now where are we bound?" And the question had frightened me. We are bound for a place 3,600 miles from here, 2,000 miles of it unbroken ocean. Most of the way it will be night. We are flying west with the night. So there behind me is Cork, and ahead of me is Berehaven Lighthouse. It is the last light, standing on the last land. I watch it, counting the frequency of its flashes. So many to the minute, then I pass it and fly out to sea. The fear is gone now. Not overcome nor reasoned away, it is gone because something else has taken its place, the confidence and the trust, the inherent belief in the security of land underfoot. Now this faith is transferred to my plane, because the land has vanished, and there is no other tangible thing to fix faith upon. Flight is but momentary escape from the eternal custody of earth. Rain continues to fall, and outside the cabin it is totally dark. My altimeter says that the Atlantic is 2,000 feet below me. My Sperry artificial horizon says that I am flying level. I judge my drift at 3 degrees more than my weather chart suggests, and fly accordingly. I am flying blind. A beam to follow would help, so would a radio, but then so would clear weather. The voice of the man at the Air Ministry had not promised storm. I feel the wind rising, and the rain falls hard. The smell of petrol in the cabin is so strong, and the roar of the planes so loud, that my senses are almost deadened. Gradually it becomes unthinkable that existence was ever otherwise. At 10:00 p.m. I am flying along the Great Circle course for Harbour Grace, Newfoundland, into a 40-mile headwind at a speed of 130 miles an hour. Because of the weather, I cannot be sure of how many more hours I have to fly, but I think it must be between 16 and 18. At 10:30 I am still flying on the large cabin tank of petrol, hoping to use it up and put an end to the liquid swirl that has rocked the plane since my takeoff. The tank has no gauge, but written on its side is the assurance, "This tank is good for 4 hours." There is nothing ambiguous about such a guarantee. I believe it, but at 25 minutes to 11 my motor coughs and dies, and the Gull is powerless above the sea. I realize that the heavy drone of the plane has been, until this moment, complete and comforting silence. It is the actual silence, following the last splutter of the engine, that stuns me. I can't feel any fear, I can't feel anything. I can only observe with a kind of stupid disinterest that my hands are violently active, and know that while they move I am being hypnotized by the needle of my altimeter. I suppose that the denial of natural impulse is what is meant by keeping calm, but impulse has reason in it. If it is night, and you are sitting in an aeroplane with a stalled motor, and there are 2,000 feet between you and the sea, nothing can be more reasonable than the impulse to pull back your stick in the hope of adding to that 2,000, if only by a little. The thought, the knowledge, the law that tells you that your hope lies not in this but in a contrary act, the act of directing your impotent craft toward the water, seems a terrifying abandonment, not only of reason but of sanity. Your mind and your heart reject it. It is your hands, your stranger's hands, that follow with unfeeling precision the letter of the law. I sit there and watch my hands push forward on the stick, and feel the Gull respond and begin its dive to the sea. Of course, it is a simple thing. Surely the cabin tank has run dry too soon. I need only to turn another petcock. But it is dark in the cabin. It is easy to see the luminous dial of the altimeter, and to note that my height is now 1,100 feet, but it is not easy to see a petcock that is somewhere near the floor of the plane. A hand gropes and reappears with an electric torch, and fingers, moving with agonizing composure, find the petcock and turn it, and I wait. At 300 feet the motor is still dead, and I am conscious that the needle of my altimeter seems to whirl like the spoke of a spindle, winding up the remaining distance between the plane and the water. There is some lightning, but the quick flash only serves to emphasize the darkness. How high can waves reach? 20 feet, perhaps? 30? It is impossible to avoid the thought that this is the end of my flight, but my reactions are not orthodox. The various incidents of my entire life do not run through my mind like a motion picture film gone mad. I only feel that all this has happened before, and it has. It has all happened 100 times in my mind, in my sleep, so that now I am not really caught in terror. I recognize a familiar scene, a familiar story with its climax dulled by too much telling. I do not know how close to the waves I am when the motor explodes to life again, but the sound is almost meaningless. I see my hand easing back on the stick, and I feel the Gull climb up into the storm, and I see the altimeter whirl like a spindle again, paying out the distance between myself and the sea. The storm is strong. It is comforting. It is like a friend shaking me and saying, "Wake up! You were only dreaming." But soon I am thinking, by simple calculation I find that my motor had been silent for perhaps an instant more than 30 seconds. I ought to thank God, and I do, though indirectly. I thank Geoffrey de Havilland, who designed the indomitable gypsy, and who, after all, must have been designed by God in the first place. A lighted ship, the daybreak, some steep cliffs standing in the sea. The meaning of these will never change for pilots. If one day an ocean can be flown within an hour, if men can build a plane that so masters time, the sight of land will be no less welcome to the steersman of that fantastic craft. He will have cheated laws that the cunning of science has taught him how to cheat, and he will feel his guilt and be eager for the sanctuary of the soil. I saw the ship and the daybreak, and then I saw the cliffs of Newfoundland wound in ribbons of fog. I felt the elation I had so long imagined, and I felt the happy guilt of having circumvented the stern authority of the weather and the sea. But mine was a minor triumph. My swift gull was not so swift as to have escaped unnoticed. The night and the storm had caught her, and we had flown blind for 19 hours. I was tired now, and cold. Ice began to film the glass of the cabin windows, and the fog played a magician's game with the land. But the land was there. I could not see it, but I had seen it. I could not afford to believe that it was any land but the land I wanted. I could not afford to believe that my navigation was at fault, because there was no time for doubt. South to Cape Race, west to Sydney on Cape Breton Island, with my protractor, my map, and my compass, I set my new course, humming the ditty that Tom had taught me. Variation west, magnetic best. Variation east, magnetic least. A silly rhyme, but it served to placate for the moment two warring poles, the magnetic and the true. I flew south, and found the lighthouse of Cape Race protruding from the fog like a warning finger. I circled twice, and went on over the Gulf of St. Lawrence. After a while there would be New Brunswick, and then Maine, and then New York. I could anticipate. I could almost say, well, if you stay awake, you'll find it's only a matter of time now. But there was no question of staying awake. I was tired, and I had not moved an inch since that uncertain moment at Abingdon when the Gull had elected to rise with her load and fly. But I could not have closed my eyes. I could sit there in the cabin, walled in glass and petrol tanks, and be grateful for the sun and the light, and the fact that I could see the water under me. They were almost the last waves I had to pass, 400 miles of water, but then the land again, Cape Breton. I would stop at Sydney to refuel and go on. It was easy now. It would be like stopping at Kisumu and going on. Success breeds confidence. But who has a right to confidence, except the gods? I had a following wind. My last tank of petrol was more than 3/4 full, and the world was as bright to me as if it were a new world never touched. If I had been wiser, I might have known that such moments are, like innocence, short-lived. My engine began to shudder before I saw the land. It died. It spluttered. It started again, and limped along. It coughed and spat black exhaust toward the sea. There are words for everything. There was a word for this. Airlock, I thought. This had to be an airlock, because there was petrol enough. I thought I might clear it by turning on and turning off all the empty tanks, and so I did that. The handles of the petcocks were sharp little pins of metal, and when I had opened and closed them a dozen times, I saw that my hands were bleeding, and that the blood was dropping on my maps and on my clothes, but the effort wasn't any good. I coasted along on a sick and halting engine. The oil pressure and the oil temperature gauges were normal, the magnetos working, and yet I lost altitude slowly while the realization of failure seeped into my heart. If I made the land, I should have been the first to fly the North Atlantic from England, but from my point of view, from a pilot's point of view, a forced landing was failure, because New York was my goal. If only I could land and then take off, I would make it still. If only. The engine cuts again, and then catches, and each time it spurts to life I climb as high as I can get, and then it splutters. and stops, and I glide once more toward the water, to rise again and descend again like a hunting seabird. I find the land. Visibility is perfect now, and I see land 40 or 50 miles ahead. If I am on my course, that will be Cape Breton. Minute after minute goes by. The minutes almost materialize. They pass before my eyes like links in a long, slow-moving chain, and each time the engine cuts, I see a broken link in the chain and catch my breath until it passes. The land is under me. I snatch my map and stare at it to confirm my whereabouts. I am, even at my present crippled speed, only 12 minutes from Sydney Airport, where I can land for repairs and then go on. The engine cuts once more, and I begin to glide. But now I am not worried. She will start again, as she has done, and I will gain altitude and fly into Sydney. But she doesn't start. This time she's dead as death. The Gull settles earthward, and it isn't any earth I know. It is black earth, stuck with boulders, and I hang above it on hope and on a motionless propeller. Only I cannot hang above it long. The earth hurries to meet me. I bank, turn, and side-slip to dodge the boulders. My wheels touch, and I feel them submerge. The nose of the plane is engulfed in mud, and I go forward, striking my head on the glass of the cabin front, hearing it shatter, feeling blood pour over my face. I stumble out of the plane and sink to my knees in muck and stand there foolishly staring, not at the lifeless land, but at my watch. 21 hours and 25 minutes. Atlantic flight. Abingdon, England. To a nameless swamp. Non-stop. A Cape Breton islander found me. A fisherman trudging over the bog saw the Gull with her tail in the air and her nose buried, and then he saw me floundering in the embracing soil of his native land. I had been wandering for an hour, and the black mud had got up to my waist, and the blood from the cut in my head had met the mud halfway. From a distance the fisherman directed me with his arms and with shouts toward the firm places in the bog, and for another hour I walked on them and came toward him, like a citizen of Hades blinded by the sun. But it wasn't the sun. I hadn't slept for 40 hours. He took me to his hut on the edge of the coast, and I found that built upon the rocks there was a little cubicle that housed an ancient telephone, put there in case of shipwrecks. I telephoned to Sydney Airport to say that I was safe and to prevent a needless search being made. On the following morning I did step out of a plane at Floyd Bennett Field, and there was a crowd of people still waiting there to greet me. But the plane I stepped from was not the Gull, and for days, while I was in New York, I kept thinking about that, and wishing over and over again that it had been the Gull, until the wish lost its significance, and time moved on, overcoming many things it met on the way.